Welcome back, hey my dear friends. Night falls over a plain so ancient that even memory seems too young for it. The wind drifts across reed beds and dark water channels. Mud glistens beneath a faint moon. Somewhere in the distance, a low fire burns beside a cluster of houses made from packed earth and timber. Beyond them, beyond any single village's reach, the land opens into marsh, floodplain, scrub, and silence. There are no maps here, no borders, no kings whose names survive in stone, no monuments yet famous enough to fill textbooks. And still something has begun, not all at once, not with a founding date, not with a trumpet blast of history, but with a slow and irreversible shift in how human beings live on the earth. This is the problem at the heart of the mystery. Everyone wants a single first civilization, a single answer. A first people who crossed some invisible threshold and became something new. The imagination craves beginnings that arrive clearly. The first city, the first kingdom, the first empire, the first writing, the first civilization on Earth. It sounds like the kind of question that should produce a name, a place, and a triumphant conclusion. But the deeper one looks, the stranger it becomes. Civilization does not appear like a sunrise. It gathers like fog. It forms in layers. It hides its own beginnings, even as it changes the human story forever. Long before the first known cities rise from river mud. Long before the first administrative tablets are pressed with marks. Long before rulers commission temples and tombs and walls. Human beings are already altering their world in quieter ways. They are watching seasons more carefully. They are storing grain. They are building houses meant to last more than a season or two. They are burying their dead in places they intend to return to. They are no longer simply moving through landscapes. They are beginning, in scattered and uneven ways, to anchor themselves to those landscapes. What survives in the record suggests that this transformation begins thousands of years before anything most people would comfortably call civilization. At first, the Earth offers no obvious stage for greatness. The earliest settled worlds are modest. A few rectangular buildings, hearths blackened with soot, grinding stones worn smooth by years of use, animal bones cracked for marrow, seeds preserved by accident in ancient ash. These remains do not look like destiny. They look small, domestic, repetitive. Yet this is often how the deepest revolutions begin. Not in palaces, but in kitchens. Not in royal decrees, but in habits. A people decides, or slowly learns, to stay longer in one place, then to return, then to rebuild, then to shape the land so that returning becomes easier. Still, before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, the temptation is to rush toward the famous names. Sumer, Egypt, the Indus, places where ruins rise high enough and records endure long enough to seem like proper beginnings. But even those worlds do not emerge from nothing. Behind every city lies a long prehistory of experiment. Behind every state lies 1,000 smaller acts of organization. Behind every written language lies generations of people who counted, remembered, exchanged, planned, and believed without writing things down in ways that survive. To ask who was first is to step into a landscape filled with partial answers and broken trails. The Pleistocene world that shapes most of human existence is not a civilized one by any definition. For tens of thousands of years, humans live as foragers, hunters, fishers, gatherers, moving through large territories with immense skill. This way of life is not primitive in the lazy sense that modern people sometimes imagine. It is flexible, knowledgeable, and astonishingly adaptive. People track migrations, read weather, understand plants, navigate rivers, coasts, forests, and grasslands. They shape fire, stone, fiber, wood, and bone into practical systems of survival. They create art, ritual, and social bonds. They bury their dead. They trade across distance in many places. They alter ecosystems long before farming arrives. The old world of mobile societies is not empty of complexity. That matters because civilization does not emerge from human simplicity. It emerges from one form of complexity, giving way to another. Then climate shifts. Ice retreats. Sea levels rise. Forests spread into some regions, while other lands open into productive grass and wetland. Around the beginning of the Holocene, roughly 11,000 to 12,000 years ago, the planet enters a warmer and more stable interval. Stable is a relative word. Floods still come. Droughts still strike. Cold snaps still disrupt fragile human plans. Yet compared with the violent swings of the last ice age, this new world offers openings. In several regions, people begin managing favored plants and animals more intensively. They settle for longer periods near rich resources. Wild cereals are harvested in larger quantities. Storage becomes more meaningful. The line between gathering and cultivation grows blurred. One of the lesser-known truths about early civilization is that it does not begin with cities at all. It begins with predictability, or rather with the human pursuit of predictability in a world that never fully grants it. If grain can be harvested, dried, stored, and guarded, winter becomes different. If animals can be managed, penned, or bred, movement becomes different. If a settlement can survive a bad season because it has food from a previous one, then population can slowly grow. Children can remain, elders can remain, buildings can become more substantial, paths become streets, by repetition, long before anyone names them. The evidence remains incomplete, but across Southwest Asia and elsewhere, the pattern becomes clearer with time. Human beings begin to invest in place. This does not make life easier in every sense. Settling down brings its own costs. Waste accumulates. Disease patterns change. Diet may become narrower and less varied. Dependence on a few crops or seasonal floods can make a community vulnerable to disaster. Social tensions sharpen when land, storage, and labor are no longer temporary matters. The old freedom to move away from conflict is reduced. In some early settled communities, skeletons preserve signs of hard, repetitive work. Teeth wear down from grit and ground grain. Bodies begin to tell a story of commitment as much as progress. Civilization, whatever else it becomes, is never simply comfort. It is concentration. It is dependence. It is the gathering of both opportunity and risk into one place. Some of the earliest large settlements known to archaeology make the mystery even more difficult. Places such as Jericho in the Levant or Çatalhöyük in Anatolia appear astonishingly early and mighty. The story. They contain substantial architecture, long-term occupation, ritual traces, and dense populations. Jericho has ancient walls and a tower of striking scale. Çatalhöyük grows into a tightly packed settlement where people move across rooftops and enter homes from above. Yet scholars still debate how these places should be understood. Were they cities in the later sense? Not quite. Were they complex, durable, socially layered communities that challenge simple definitions? Absolutely. They remind us that the road to civilization is not a neat staircase. It is a thicket of experiments, some leading toward later urban worlds, others ending in forms that leave no straightforward descendants. And so the old question starts to wobble. If one asks for the first civilization, should the answer belong to the first people who farmed? That cannot be right, because farming alone does not produce cities or states. Should it belong to the first people who built monuments? That fails too, because monumentality can appear without bureaucracy on an imperial scale. Should it belong to the first people who gathered in large settled communities? Even that is uncertain, because size alone does not produce what later ages recognize as civilization. The closer one moves to the beginning, the less there is a single threshold, and the more there are clusters of thresholds crossed at different times by different peoples under different conditions. There is another reason the beginning remains difficult to see. The earliest evidence is often made of fragile things. Mud brick melts back into earth. Reed structures vanish. Wood rots. Floodplains bury their own past beneath newer layers of silt. Coastlines where early communities once stood may now lie underwater, swallowed by post-glacial seas. Whole chapters of the human transition to settled life may be missing. not because they never happened, but because preservation was selective and merciless. Archaeology is forced to work with what survives, not with everything that once existed. No single explanation fully accounts for this silence. Time erases unevenly. Wetlands preserve one object and destroy another. Deserts protect what forests consume. A place may have been crucial and still leave almost nothing behind. This is why the first civilization often appears in popular memory to emerge suddenly in southern Mesopotamia, where later evidence becomes abundant enough to tell a more legible story. But that apparent suddenness is deceptive. By the time the first cities rise there in a form that most scholars recognize without hesitation, countless earlier developments have already unfolded across millennia. Sedentary life, food production, ritual architecture, exchange networks, craft specialization, and local hierarchies are already part of the human landscape. The first civilization, if such a phrase is to mean anything, stands on top of an older foundation of village worlds, sacred sites, and agricultural experiments stretching far back into prehistory. What makes the mystery so compelling is not just that the answer is unclear, it is that the question itself reveals something about modern expectations. People want origins that behave like inventions: a wheel, a bronze blade, a written symbol, a named king. Civilization refuses that simplicity. It is not a tool made by one hand, or a law announced on one date. It is a slow entangling of people, land, belief, labor, memory, power, and survival. It begins in ordinary repetition, and ends, if it ever truly begins at all, in systems so large that individuals disappear inside them. Somewhere on that ancient plain, the fire burns lower, the settlement sleeps. Beyond its houses, dark fields wait for morning. No one there knows they are living near the edge of a transformation that later ages will try to pin to a single cradle. They do not know that future scholars will sift their seeds, measure their bones, and argue over whether this was already civilization or only the road toward it. They know only the river, the harvest, the walls that need repair, the dead who must be remembered, the season that may fail, and the hope that stored grain will last until the next one. The beginning of civilization is hidden in lives like these, not because they are too small to matter, but because they matter so much that everything afterward grows out of them. By the time history learns to write its own name, the first act is already over. Or perhaps it never had a single act at all. What remains is a landscape of clues, villages turning permanent, fields widening, ritual deepening, populations thickening, memory taking root in place. The search for the first civilization begins there, in that dim, uncertain zone, where humanity stops, merely passing through the world, and starts trying for the first time, on an unprecedented scale, to reorganize it around itself. The trouble begins with the word itself. Civilization sounds solid, ancient, unquestionable, as if it refers to a natural category, waiting patiently in the past for historians to discover it. In reality, it is a label imposed much later, and like many labels applied to deep history, it carries more baggage than certainty. It suggests a dividing line between before and after, between societies that count and societies that merely prepare the way. That is one reason the search for the first civilization so often becomes confused. The deeper problem is not just that the evidence is incomplete, it is that the standard itself keeps shifting. Ask 5 scholars to define civilization, and the answers will overlap without ever fully matching. One may begin with cities, because the very word evokes dense settlements, streets, workshops, administration, and monumental buildings. Another may begin with the state, with political centralization, strong enough to organize labor, collect tribute, and enforce hierarchy across a significant territory. A third may insist on writing, arguing that without durable records, taxation, law, royal memory, and bureaucratic continuity remain too limited or too invisible to justify the term. Others emphasize social stratification, craft specialization, temple institutions, long-distance trade, monumental architecture, or systems of formal religion tied to ruling power. Each definition captures something real. None captures everything. The evidence remains incomplete, and the concept itself is not innocent. This matters because the answer changes depending on which doorway one chooses. If civilization means the earliest permanent farming communities, then the story begins very early indeed, in worlds of mud houses, granaries, and local ritual long before kingship or writing appear. If civilization requires cities, then the spotlight falls later, especially on places like Uruk in southern Mesopotamia, where settlement size, labor organization, and administrative control become difficult to mistake. If civilization requires a territorial state under centralized authority, then early dynastic Egypt becomes a formidable claimant, because the Nile Valley produces not merely villages and towns, but one of the earliest durable unified kingdoms on earth. If writing is essential, then the discussion narrows again, and Sumer regains its familiar advantage, because the earliest known writing emerges there in an unmistakable administrative context. The desire for a first civilization often hides a simpler desire underneath, the wish for a first fully recognizable world, one that looks enough like later history to feel real. People are more comfortable with palaces than storage pits, with rulers than elders, with written laws than habits, with temples that dominate skylines rather than sacred places half buried in soil. Yet deep history does not arrange itself for that convenience. Human societies do not move in lockstep from simple to complex, then from complex to civilized. Some communities grow large without becoming states. Some build monuments without cities. Some farm intensively without writing. Some maintain social hierarchy without monumental architecture. Some leave so little behind that their complexity must be inferred from fragments. Beads, bones, house plans, obsidian blades carried across improbable distances. There is also an old habit, now increasingly criticized, of treating civilization as a prize rather than a description. 19th and early 20th century scholarship often used the term in ways that blurred analysis with judgment. Civilized did not merely mean urban or literate. It often implied superior, advanced, fully human in a way that other people supposedly were not. That language distorted the past and justified all kinds of lazy thinking. Mobile peoples were dismissed. Village societies were treated as if they existed only to wait for the arrival of states. Entire ways of life were reduced to stepping stones. Modern archaeology and anthropology have spent decades trying to dismantle that hierarchy, because the older view mistook one kind of complexity for the only kind that mattered. The older, foraging world, for example, is not devoid of order, planning, symbolism, or long-distance connection. Nor are early village societies socially flat by default. Even before unmistakable civilizations appear, people gather at ritual centers, exchange prestige goods, organize collective labor, and maintain inherited traditions tied to place and ancestry. At sites like Göbekli Tepe, astonishing stone enclosures rise before farming seems fully established in the surrounding region. Scholars still debate exactly how these communities were organized and what such places meant to them. But the message is unmistakable. Monumentality does not patiently wait for civilization to grant permission. Human beings are capable of symbolic ambition very early, and sometimes in social forms that do not fit later expectations. That is why the word civilization can become a trap. Once it is treated as a strict category with a clean border, it begins excluding exactly the kinds of evidence that matter most for understanding how complex societies actually emerge. A settlement may be too early, too small, too decentralized, too non-literate, too archaeologically fragmentary, and yet still contain elements that later become central to urban life: storage, coordination, shared ritual, inherited inequality, seasonal aggregation, specialized labor, landscape management. These are not decorative details. They are the raw materials out of which later civilizations are made. Even the word city, which seems more straightforward, becomes slippery when pushed far enough into prehistory. How many people make a city? Is it population size alone? Is it density? Is it the presence of monumental public buildings? Is it the existence of administrative quarters or specialized districts? A place like Çatalhöyük can be vast for its time, densely occupied, rich in symbolism, and still not operate like later urban centers. A place like Jericho can possess defenses and communal structures of surprising scale, and still resist easy classification. Scholars still debate where large village ends and city begins, because settlement form alone does not reveal every social relationship inside it. The same problem follows the state. Central authority is often invisible in its earliest phases. A settlement may have leaders without kings, councils without palaces, prestige households without formal bureaucracy. Hierarchy can exist before it becomes monumental. Coercion can exist before it leaves inscriptions. Local temple institutions may organize labor before royal administration absorbs or rivals them. Southern Mesopotamia offers a particularly tangled case, because some of the earliest urban growth seems to occur through a fusion of sacred institutions, economic management, and emergent political power, rather than through a fully formed monarchy descending onto the scene from above. The first civilization, if one insists on the phrase, does not arrive with its own instruction manual. Writing, too, is both crucial and misleading. It matters enormously because it stabilizes memory in new ways. It allows accounts, inventories, offerings, taxes, labor obligations, and eventually stories, laws, and royal claims to outlive the people who first shaped them. But writing is not the same thing as thought, and its absence does not mean the absence of complexity. The earliest writing in Mesopotamia begins not with poetry, but with accounting. Tokens, tallies, and clay impressions develop toward marks that can track goods and obligations. This is a turning point in administrative power, but it does not mean that societies without writing are somehow suspended outside history. It means only that their history must be read through other traces, and those traces are often harder to interpret. One lesser-known difficulty is that civilizations sometimes appear clearer in retrospect than they did to the people living through their formation. Later rulers love to invent origins. They claim ancient legitimacy, divine favor, or foundational ancestors. They impose continuity, where the real story may have been messy, regional, and uncertain. Archaeology often reveals what polished royal memory tries to hide: abandoned phases, overlapping cultures, gradual transitions, contested authority, old practices living on beneath new institutions. The beginning of civilization, in other words, may not have felt like a beginning at all. It may have felt like more fields to manage, more mouths to feed, more obligations to temples, more labor diverted into walls and canals, more distinctions between those who command and those who obey. There is another complication. Civilizations do not all assemble the same pieces in the same order. In Mesopotamia, cities and writing appear early and dramatically, but political unification remains unstable for long stretches. In Egypt, political centralization becomes strikingly durable and visually overwhelming, while the river valley gives a different shape to settlement and statecraft than the alluvial mosaic of southern Iraq. In the Indus world, large planned cities flourish with sophisticated drainage and standardization. Yet, the surviving evidence offers no obvious kings in the Mesopotamian or Egyptian mold. Norte Chico, in the Andean region, presents still another puzzle. Monumental architecture and organized labor appear very early, yet writing in the usual sense is absent. No single explanation fully accounts for this variation, because human complexity is not produced by one recipe. So when modern textbooks say that Sumer was the first civilization, they are not necessarily wrong, but they are compressing many choices into one sentence. Usually they mean that Sumer offers the earliest widely accepted combination of true urbanism, institutional power, and writing, all visible enough in the archaeological record to make the case compelling. That is a strong argument. It is not the same as saying that nothing comparably important happened before it, or that other regions were simply waiting their turn. The record suggests something more subtle, that multiple societies cross different thresholds of complexity at different times, and that what we call civilization is the convergence of several processes rather than a single invention. This is why the question remains so attractive. It seems simple enough to ask at a glance, but once opened, it exposes the machinery of history itself. What counts as evidence? Which traits matter most? How much absence can be tolerated before certainty collapses? Whether civilization is a status, a bundle of institutions, a style of living, or merely a modern convenience for grouping very different ancient societies under one banner. Scholars still debate these boundaries, not because the past is empty, but because it is crowded with beginnings that do not line up neatly. And the deeper one goes, the more one sees that civilization is less a switch being flipped than a web tightening over time. Houses become neighborhoods. Storage becomes administration. Ritual becomes institution. Leadership becomes hierarchy. Exchange becomes dependency. Memory becomes record. A village becomes something larger, something stranger, something powerful enough to shape the lives of thousands who will never know most of the people on whom they depend. The word civilization points toward that transformation. It does not fully contain it, so the search cannot begin by naming a winner. It must begin by admitting that the finish line has been moved repeatedly by the people trying to identify it. Only then does the ancient landscape become visible in the right way, not as a waiting room before civilization, but as a world already thick with experiments in permanence, order, and power. Some of those experiments fail, some plateau, some disappear, and a few, under particular conditions, become large enough and durable enough to leave no doubt that a new scale of human life has appeared. The difficulty is deciding when that new scale becomes civilization, rather than merely the road leading toward it. Long before kings stand beneath carved emblems, and long before scribes press reeds into clay, there are villages that begin to hold human life in place, with a new kind of gravity. They do not look like the first civilizations. That is precisely why they matter. They are the quiet proof that the foundations of later urban worlds are laid not by sudden brilliance, but by repetition, patience, and a changing relationship between people and land. If civilization is eventually built from administration, hierarchy, and memory made durable, then its deeper roots lie here, in communities where staying put becomes less an accident of season and more a deliberate structure of life. The shift is not universal, and it is not clean. Across the early Holocene world, many human groups remain mobile, and often for good reason. Mobility is resilience. It spreads risk, follows animals, tracks ripening plants, and avoids exhausting one patch of ground. Settled life only becomes attractive under certain conditions, where resources are rich enough, predictable enough, or manageable enough to reward long-term investment. In some regions, that means wild cereals growing abundantly enough to harvest repeatedly. In others, it means rivers, wetlands, fish runs, nut groves, or mixed landscapes that offer a broad seasonal economy. Sedentism in its earliest form does not always begin with agriculture. Sometimes it begins because a place is simply too useful to leave for long. That is one of the surprising details often lost in simplified stories. Farming is not a magic switch that creates villages overnight. In several regions, people settle more permanently before domestication is fully in place. They gather, store, build, and return. Over time, those habits alter their choices. Once houses are built, graves are established, storage facilities created, and fields or foraging zones carefully managed, place begins to accumulate meaning as well as utility. A settlement becomes more than shelter. It becomes an inheritance. The dead are nearby. The walls hold memory. The labor already spent on one location makes abandoning it increasingly costly. In the Levant, the Natufian culture offers an early glimpse of this world. Beginning around 15,000 years ago, well before the full flowering of agriculture, some communities establish semi-sedentary or sedentary settlements supported by intensive use of wild grains and other local resources. Stone-built structures appear, grinding tools multiply, burials anchor people to particular places. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the degree and stability of sedentism across the region. But the broader pattern is significant. Here are people living in ways that already blur the old boundary between forager and farmer, mobile and settled. They are not yet citizens of cities, yet they are no longer simply passing through the land. The houses themselves matter more than they first seem to. An early house is not just a roof over a fire. It is a machine for returning. Once a family or household invests in walls, floors, storage bins, hearths and repairs, permanence begins to shape daily life. Architecture changes time. It turns survival from a sequence of movements into a cycle organized around one central place. It also changes social relations. Neighbors are no longer temporary companions on a seasonal route. They are enduring presences, sometimes allies, sometimes rivals, always close. Space must now be negotiated. Access to food stores, water, land and labor becomes a matter of lasting consequence. With permanence comes accumulation. Portable life encourages restraint. Settled life allows objects to multiply. Grinding stones, large containers, fixed ovens, building materials, tools stored for future use, ritual items kept in specific locations. All of these thicken a household's investment in place. A village is not just a cluster of people. It is a concentration of material commitments. What survives in the record suggests that these commitments begin to change how human communities imagine obligation, ownership, continuity, and descent. The living inherit more than stories now. They inherit walls, paths, fields, and claims. Then the pressure of numbers begins to matter. A small camp can divide and move when friction rises. A village cannot do so as easily, especially when land nearby is already occupied, or when the economy depends on built infrastructure and managed resources. Population density changes human behavior. It increases cooperation in some domains and conflict in others. Shared labor becomes more important. So do rules, whether formal or customary. Who stores grain where? Who works which plot? Who repairs communal features? Who may marry whom? Who speaks for the group in dealings with outsiders? None of this requires a state, but it does require a thicker social fabric than highly mobile life usually demands. A thicker social fabric leaves traces, though rarely in forms that announce themselves loudly. One sees it in settlement layout. One sees it in communal buildings or unusually large structures that imply gatherings beyond the household level. One sees it in storage capacity, in the standardized repetition of house plans, in evidence that people return to the same place generation after generation. One sees it in the dead, too. Burial customs often become more elaborate and more localized in settled communities. Ancestors are not merely remembered, they are placed. Sometimes they are placed beneath floors, within domestic space itself, as though the living are building not just over land, but over memory. Jericho stands out in this regard, and for good reason. In the Jordan Valley, occupation at the site stretches back to astonishing antiquity. By the pre-pottery Neolithic, the settlement includes substantial architecture and one of the most famous constructions in early archaeology, a massive stone tower associated with a wall. Its exact meaning remains debated. Was it defensive, symbolic, related to flood control, or some mixture of these? No single explanation fully accounts for it. Yet, whatever its precise function, it reveals organized labor and communal effort on a scale that unsettles easy assumptions about what early villages could do. Jericho is not yet a city in the later Mesopotamian sense, but it is far beyond the image of a simple hamlet. Then there is Çatalhöyük, in central Anatolia, occupied millennia later, but still long before the classic first civilizations. It spreads into a vast, densely packed settlement, where houses cluster side by side, with almost no streets between them. People move across rooftops. Entrances are cut through ceilings. Interiors hold platforms, ovens, paintings, plastered surfaces, and burials beneath floors. The settlement is rich in symbolism, yet oddly resistant to the standard signs of centralized authority. There are no obvious palaces, no unmistakable temples towering above the rest, no grand royal tombs. Scholars still debate how socially stratified the community was, and whether certain households held special ritual or economic roles, but the larger lesson is clear. Human beings are capable of building large, enduring, complex communities without immediately producing kingship or bureaucracy in a later recognizable form. That fact complicates every straight-line story about civilization. Villages are not mere waiting rooms for cities. They are laboratories of permanence. In them, people test solutions to problems that later civilizations inherit on a far larger scale. How to feed more people from a limited landscape, how to organize work, how to store and protect surplus, how to manage disputes when departure is no longer easy, how to bind the living to place through ritual, memory, and the dead, how to construct a shared world durable enough to outlast individual lives. These are civilizational questions before civilization, though the people answering them would not have used that word. The move toward agriculture sharpens these dynamics, but again, not in a single leap. Domestication unfolds gradually and unevenly. Plants and animals change through repeated human selection, while human communities change in response to their increasing dependence on them. Wheat, barley, lentils, goats, sheep, and later cattle become part of new economic systems across Southwest Asia. The advantages are obvious enough: stored calories, more predictable food supply under favorable conditions, the ability to support larger populations, yet the costs are equally real. Farming ties people to annual cycles of planting and harvest. It narrows diet. It demands labor at fixed times. It exposes communities to crop failure, pests, flood variation, and drought. Early settled life can be productive, but it is rarely carefree. This is one reason early village worlds often show both resilience and fragility at once. A settlement may endure for centuries, even millennia, yet remain vulnerable to environmental stress, disease, social fracture, or simple exhaustion of nearby resources. Some sites grow, contract, relocate, or disappear. Others become more deeply rooted. The archaeological record preserves these rhythms only imperfectly. Mud brick collapses and is rebuilt. Floors accumulate in layers. Refuse mounds rise. A village becomes a tell, an artificial hill made from generations of living and rebuilding in the same place. These layered mounds are among the most revealing archives of the human shift toward permanence. Each layer is a small declaration. We stayed. We rebuilt. We stayed again. A lesser-known but important feature of these early villages is that they often sit within wider networks rather than in isolation. Obsidian from distant volcanic sources, shells from coasts, pigments, stone, and crafted goods travel across significant distances. Exchange does not begin with civilization. It is already old by the time the first cities emerge. But in settled communities, exchange becomes more structurally important. It links villages to one another, moves desirable materials inland, and may help establish status differences or ritual relationships. The world of villages is therefore not small in imagination, even when it is modest in architecture. People know of other places. They value objects from afar. They are part of worlds broader than their own horizon. All of this means that by the time true cities appear, humanity has already lived, for millennia, in communities that have transformed family life, work, time, land use, memory, and power. The village has taught people how to remain, how to build, how to store, how to inherit, and how to belong to a place so intensely that leaving becomes not just a physical act, but a social rupture. Civilization does not descend onto a blank landscape. It rises from these older experiments, where the first real victory is not empire or writing, but the ability to make permanence feel normal. And permanence changes the mind. When people expect to remain, they begin planning further ahead. Fields are improved for future harvests, not just present needs. Houses are repaired with children and grandchildren in mind. Paths become habitual. Boundaries matter more. The dead accumulate beneath the living, and the living organize themselves around obligations that no migration can easily dissolve. Somewhere in this slow compression of life, the village begins to carry the weight of history. Not written history yet, not the history of dynasties and campaigns, but the deeper kind, the layering of generations in one place, until place itself becomes an actor in human life. That is why villages come before kingdoms in more than chronology. They come before them in logic. They teach people to endure one another at close range, to depend on stored abundance, to negotiate space, to transmit claims, to live within structures more permanent than memory alone. Only after that long apprenticeship do the larger concentrations become possible. Cities will later magnify these pressures into systems. States will codify them. Writing will record them. But the first decisive step has already been taken in mud-brick rooms, shared courtyards, crowded rooftops, and fields just beyond the last house, where human beings first begin in earnest to build a world they do not intend to leave. The first great change is not the city, it is the field. Before walls rise high enough to impress later ages, before scribes measure barley rations, and temple officials count laborers, human beings learn to bind their survival to patches of ground that must be worked, watched, protected, and remembered. A village can exist on many kinds of abundance, but civilization, in the fuller sense, requires something more difficult. Surplus that can be produced repeatedly, stored reliably enough to outlast bad seasons, and concentrated in ways that support people who do not all grow their own food. That is where rivers enter the story with such force, and why the old landscapes of flood and silt stand so near the beginning of nearly every conventional answer. Rivers do not create civilization by themselves. They flood, shift course, drown fields, breed insects, and deposit both life and destruction in the same motion. Yet few environments offer so much to a dense human population. Seasonal flooding renews soil. Water allows cultivation in places where rain alone is too uncertain. Wetlands provide fish, reeds, birds, transport routes, and pasturage. Floodplains flatten movement and encourage concentration. To later observers, these landscapes can seem almost destined for civilization. But destiny is too neat a word. A river must first become legible. Its rhythms must be studied. Its danger must be endured. Its possibilities must be turned into routine, through labor that is repeated generation after generation. In the earliest farming societies, that routine begins in humble acts. Sowing, weeding, harvesting, drying grain, repairing storage bins, guarding crops against animals, saving seed, watching the sky and the waterline. The labor is relentless, because agriculture is not simply food gathering made easier. It is a commitment to delayed return. Effort must be invested months before the reward arrives, and the reward itself depends on forces no one fully controls. Rain fails, floods come early or late, pests spread, the soil tires. A community that depends on crops learns quickly that abundance is fragile. This is one reason surplus matters so much. It is not luxury at first. It is insurance against a world that still refuses to behave. Grain becomes especially important because it lends itself to the logic of civilization in the ways that many other foods do not. Cereals such as wheat and barley can be harvested in bulk, dried, stored, measured, and redistributed. They can feed large populations if the harvest holds. They can also be counted. This seemingly simple fact has enormous consequences. A food that can be measured can be taxed. A harvest that can be stored can be claimed. A granary can become an instrument of both survival and authority. What survives in the record suggests that long before formal states emerge in unmistakable form, the management of stored food is already reshaping social power. But fields and granaries do not merely support larger populations, they make larger populations necessary. Agriculture often rewards labor concentration at critical moments. Planting and harvest demand coordination. Irrigation channels, where they exist, must be maintained collectively. Storage facilities must be built and protected. Herds must be managed. Paths to fields become part of daily routine. The entire settlement begins to pulse, according to a seasonal calendar more exacting than the rhythms of many foraging societies. Time itself changes character. It becomes agricultural time, measured by water, sprouting, ripening, flood, and scarcity. A people living by crops are never entirely free of the next season, because the next season is always already being prepared. This is where rivers become both allies and masters. In places where rainfall agriculture is uncertain or insufficient, river systems allow cultivation on a scale that would otherwise be impossible. Yet river life is never passive. A floodplain gives fertility in exchange for vigilance. The water must arrive, but not too violently. It must recede, but not too soon. Channels may need clearing. Embankments may require repair. Low-lying land may be productive one year and ruinous the next. Scholars still debate exactly how early irrigation and large-scale water management developed in different regions, especially in southern Mesopotamia, where the evidence is complex and the process likely gradual. But no single explanation fully accounts for the scale of later urban growth there, without recognizing how profoundly water control and agricultural surplus eventually shape the social order. Surplus, though, is never just more food. It is stored possibility. Once a community can regularly produce beyond immediate subsistence, new arrangements become feasible. Some people can spend more time making pottery, weaving textiles, quarrying stone, smelting metals in later ages, or conducting ritual on behalf of others. Some households can accumulate more than their neighbors. Some institutions, whether sacred or political, can collect and redistribute resources. Surplus makes specialization possible, and specialization makes society more intricate. But it also introduces dependence. The potter depends on the farmer. The priest depends on offerings. The laborer who digs canals may depend on rations controlled by others. Complexity grows by weaving lives together more tightly, and that woven structure is never neutral. One of the most important and least romantic truths about early civilization is that inequality grows well in fertile soil. Once land, water access, labor, and stored food become central to survival, differences in control over them begin to matter intensely. Some families may command more labor. Some ritual leaders may claim a privileged role in maintaining cosmic or seasonal order. Some lineages may establish stronger claims to the best land or the safest storage. Some settlements may dominate smaller neighbors through exchange or force. Hierarchy need not appear all at once. It can gather slowly in repeated advantages that become tradition before they become law. Archaeology glimpses this process unevenly in house sizes, burial goods, storage patterns, prestige materials, and the built environment itself. The evidence remains incomplete, but the overall pattern is difficult to ignore. Surplus feeds both population and power. That power is often justified through necessity. If water systems must be maintained, someone must organize labor. If food stores must be protected, someone must oversee them. If the gods are believed to govern fertility, someone must mediate with them. Practical and sacred authority can easily reinforce one another in such worlds. A canal that fails is not only an engineering problem, it may be a social crisis. A poor harvest is not merely hunger. It can become a test of leadership, legitimacy, ritual order, and communal trust. The more people depend on systems larger than the household, the more room there is for institutions to arise that claim to manage those systems. Floodplains also alter settlement scale. Fertile land supports denser populations, and denser populations allow certain settlements to outgrow others. Villages clustered near productive water sources may thicken into networks of dependent communities. A central place may emerge where exchange is concentrated, ritual is formalized, and authority begins to settle. Not every fertile valley produces a city, and not every large village becomes a political center. Yet riverine landscapes repeatedly provide the conditions under which scale becomes possible. That is why they recur with such force in early civilizational history. The Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus, the Yellow River Basin, and elsewhere. Different rivers produce different worlds, but all reveal the same underlying tension. Abundance allows concentration. Concentration demands management. Management opens the door to hierarchy. The environmental side of this story is often told too gently. Fertile landscapes are rarely stable gifts. The same flood that renews soil may wipe out a season's work. Salts may build in irrigated fields over time, especially in arid regions where evaporation is high. Channels silt up, river courses migrate, marshes expand and contract. Overuse can weaken the very systems that support growth. One lesser-known irony of early agriculture is that the more successful it becomes, the more vulnerable it can make a society to environmental disruption. A foraging group with diversified subsistence strategies can sometimes shift its range when conditions worsen. A dense agricultural population rooted to fields, storage, and infrastructure cannot move so easily. Civilization from an early stage is therefore a wager against uncertainty, and rivers are both the best partners and the most dangerous ones in making that bet. The alluvial south of Mesopotamia offers a particularly sharp version of this problem. It is a land of astonishing potential and constant management, created by the sediments of the Tigris and Euphrates and their shifting branches. Rainfall alone is insufficient for easy farming in much of the region. Water must be channeled, timed, and controlled. Yet when these conditions are met, the land can support extraordinary productivity. This productivity later helps sustain the large settlements, temple economies, and administrative structures that make Sumer such a strong claimant in the search for the first civilization. But even here, the story does not begin with glory. It begins with mud, labor, reeds, ditches, uncertainty, and the long discipline of making an unstable landscape feed more people than it naturally should. The river also changes imagination. A community that depends on seasonal rise and retreat becomes intensely observant. Calendars matter more. Omens matter more. Rituals tied to water, fertility, and cosmic order can gain unusual force. In some early societies, rulers later present themselves not merely as military leaders or tax collectors, but as guarantors of abundance, protectors of irrigation, intermediaries between divine order and agricultural success. This fusion of ecology and ideology is one of the deep roots of civilization. Food does not only sustain institutions, it legitimizes them. A full granary can be read as proof that the system works. An empty one can be read as a judgment against it. And with surplus comes memory of a new kind. Good years and bad years are no longer private household experiences alone. They become communal events. Storage requires planning beyond the moment. Redistribution requires record, whether oral at first or written later. Obligations accumulate. Debts become thinkable. So do reserves, rations, and quotas. The field therefore does more than feed the city to be. It teaches abstraction. It turns harvest into units, labor into schedules, land into claims, and people into participants in systems broader than kinship alone. A village can run largely on familiarity. A larger society cannot. Surplus is the bridge from one to the other. This is why the rise of civilization is inseparable from the rise of pressure. More mouths gather where the land is rich. More effort is required to keep richness reliable. More coordination produces more authority. More authority tends to produce more inequality. The same processes that make literature, administration, and monumental architecture possible also tighten the bonds of dependence around ordinary lives. The farmer becomes necessary in a new way, but not always powerful. The field becomes the source of wealth, but also of obligation. The river sustains the settlement, yet holds it hostage to its own moods. Civilization does not emerge from abundance alone. It emerges from the management of abundance under stress. By the time the first unmistakable urban worlds appear, this logic is already well advanced. Population has thickened, land has been divided, claimed, worked, and remembered. Water has become both a technical problem and a sacred concern. Surplus has begun to support specialists, leaders, and institutions that stand above the household. In that sense, the city is not the beginning of the story, but the visible surface of a deeper transformation. Beneath every temple platform and palace wall lies an older world of sowing, flood watching, canal clearing, grain measuring, and anxious calculation. The first civilization is impossible without that world, because before human beings learn to build power out of stone and record, they first have to learn how to build it out of mud, water, and stored seed. Then, almost without warning, if one looks only at the grand outline, the world becomes urban. The villages and farming communities of earlier millennia do not vanish. But in southern Mesopotamia, something new gathers out of their accumulated habits. Settlement thickens into hierarchy. Temples rise above ordinary houses. Labor scales upward. Administration begins to leave marks. A landscape once dotted with communities becomes one in which certain places draw people, goods, authority, and memory toward themselves with unusual force. This is the threshold where many historians, archaeologists, and textbook writers begin to feel more confident. Here at last is a world that looks unmistakably civilizational. Here is the first great urban experiment. Southern Mesopotamia is an unlikely cradle in some respects. It is not a land of easy stone, timber, or stable borders. Much of it is alluvial plain, flat, muddy, vulnerable, and dependent on the shifting logic of rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates and the channels and marshlands connected to them create a landscape of both fertility and fragility. Rainfall is too limited in many areas for simple dry farming on a large scale. Water management matters. Canals matter. Organized labor matters. Yet because of this very dependence, the region becomes a place where coordination can generate extraordinary returns. What survives in the record suggests that once certain thresholds are crossed, growth accelerates in ways difficult to miss. The Ubaid period lays much of the groundwork, long before the best-known cities of Sumer dominate the scene. Communities in southern Mesopotamia already show signs of increasing settlement, complexity, shared material culture, and institutional development. Ubaid sites reveal houses, pottery traditions, and above all, temple-like buildings that hint at communal or sacred centers exceeding the scale of ordinary domestic life. These early institutions matter because they suggest that the household is no longer the only, meaningful unit of organization. A larger authority is taking shape, perhaps religious at first, perhaps already economic and political, in ways that are difficult to separate. Scholars still debate the exact balance of these functions, but the pattern is clear enough. The village world is being reorganized around centers that can coordinate labor and resources, beyond kinship alone. Temple institutions are especially important in this early Mesopotamian story because they seem to gather several civilizational functions into one place. A temple is not merely a building for prayer in the later sense. It may serve as a focal point for offerings, storage, redistribution, ritual, status, landholding, and labor organization. In a world where fertility, flood, and divine order are inseparable in human thought, The sacred is not a separate sphere, floating above daily life. It is woven into the management of that life. Grain offered to the gods is also grain entering an institutional system. Labor performed in sacred service may also be labor that binds a population into larger structures of control. The evidence remains incomplete, but no single explanation fully accounts for early Mesopotamian urbanization without recognizing how temple economies likely helped pull people into durable networks of dependence. As the Uruk period unfolds, the scale becomes harder to ignore. Settlements grow larger, and some of them grow dramatically larger than others. Southern Mesopotamia begins to show clear signs of settlement hierarchy, with major centers surrounded by smaller communities that appear increasingly tied to them. This is one of the decisive markers of a civilizational shift. A landscape of many villages becomes a landscape of centers and peripheries. Resources flow inward, authority radiates outward. People no longer live merely in a patchwork of local communities. They live in systems. At the center of this transformation lies the city that has become almost synonymous with the question of beginnings, Uruk. Even before focusing on its most famous features, the sheer fact of its size is startling. By the late 4th millennium BCE, Uruk is unlike anything seen before at such scale. Estimates vary, as they often do in archaeology, but the city appears to have covered an enormous area and supported a population that places it among the largest urban settlements in the world at the time, perhaps the largest. This is not just a bigger village. It is a concentration of human life, so dense, so organized, and so materially ambitious, that many scholars regard it as the first fully developed city in history. The scale is visible not only in population but in construction. Monumental architecture emerges with unmistakable force in Uruk. Temple complexes, such as those in the Ana precinct and the Anu district, dominate space and labor. Platforms, courtyards, monumental buildings, and carefully arranged ritual centers show that ordinary life is now overshadowed by institutions able to command impressive amounts of material and effort. Mud brick remains the essential medium, but mud brick on this scale becomes political. It represents planning, administration, extraction, and sustained collective labor. A great building is not only a structure, it is proof that someone can organize the hands to make it, and the surplus to feed those hands while they work. This is one of the subtle but decisive differences between earlier complex settlements and the urban world now taking shape. In a large village, communal effort may produce an exceptional tower, wall, or ritual enclosure. In Uruk and its peers, collective labor becomes continuous rather than exceptional. Monumentality is no longer an isolated act. It becomes part of the normal functioning of the city. Buildings are rebuilt, expanded, formalized. Space itself is institutionalized. The city begins to impose a social order through architecture, making power visible and routine. Alongside monumental building comes intensified specialization. The urban population cannot consist solely of farmers. Some must produce pottery, textiles, tools, bricks, and ritual goods. Some must transport materials. Some must supervise work. Some must maintain buildings or channels. Some must serve institutional households. This diversification of labor is one of the classic signs of civilization, but in early Mesopotamia, it appears not as abstract theory, but as lived necessity. The larger the city grows, the more its inhabitants depend on systems of provisioning and control that reach beyond the walls and deep into the countryside. The city is not self-sufficient. It feeds on a broader landscape. Trade and exchange enlarge that landscape even further. Southern Mesopotamia lacks many raw materials essential to advanced production and display. There is little good building stone, limited timber, and no local abundance of metals. Yet Uruk and related centers acquire materials from afar: stone, wood, metals, perhaps prestige items, and exotic goods moving through long-distance exchange networks that connect Mesopotamia to regions far beyond the alluvium. This is another reason the urban experiment matters. It is not merely local concentration. It is outward linkage. Civilization here grows by tying distant zones into systems of demand, movement, and value. The city becomes a magnet, not only for nearby grain, but for the wider world. One lesser-known but striking aspect of the Uruk expansion is that it may not have been confined to internal growth alone. Archaeologists have found evidence of Uruk material culture and influence at sites beyond southern Mesopotamia, suggesting colonies, enclaves, trading outposts, or some other form of contact and projection into neighboring regions. The exact nature of this expansion remains debated. Were these directly controlled settlements, merchant communities, emulative local sites, adopting urban styles? The evidence does not allow a single, simple answer. But what survives in the record suggests that urban Mesopotamia is already experimenting not only with scale at home, but with extension abroad. That is a remarkable development for so early a period. And then there is writing, or rather, its beginning. The earliest known writing emerges in this same broader context, initially in forms so practical that their later cultural prestige can seem almost ironic. These first signs are not literary epics, but administrative records. Clay tablets track goods, labor, and perhaps institutional obligations. Before full writing, there are tokens, sealings, and accounting devices. Then marks become more systematic. Information that once had to be held in memory or embodied in objects can now be fixed on clay. This changes everything. Even before anyone writes a myth or a royal inscription, administration becomes more durable. Institutions become less dependent on individual recollection. The city can remember its scale. Cylinder seals belong to this world as well, and they are among the most revealing objects in early Mesopotamian archaeology. Rolled across wet clay, they produce detailed images and serve as signatures, security devices, markers of authority, and symbols of institutional procedure. They suggest a society increasingly concerned with authentication, property, accountability, and controlled access. Such concerns do not arise in emptiness. They arise when goods are stored in volume, when labor is organized beyond face-to-face familiarity, and when institutions need ways to make claims that can be recognized and enforced. The seal is a small object, but it belongs to a very large transformation. Yet, even here, where the case for civilization seems strongest, certainty is not total. Scholars still debate how power is structured in early Uruk. Did temples dominate completely? Were secular authorities already separate and rising? How centralized were decisions? How coercive was labor organization? How much of the system depended on ideology, ritual prestige, economic necessity, or outright compulsion? The evidence remains incomplete, because the ruins preserve buildings and tablets more readily than they preserve the feelings of those who served inside them. One can see the system, one cannot always see how it was experienced from below. Still, the turning point is unmistakable. Earlier sections of the human story are full of experiments in settled life, agriculture, ritual, and social concentration. In Uruk period Mesopotamia, these experiments fuse into something on a new scale. Population, monumentality, institutional power, administrative technology, and regional influence come together in ways that make the old village world seem transformed beyond world recognition. This is why so many scholars return here when the question is asked plainly, who was first, really? Not first to settle, not first to farm, not first to gather in large communities, but first to generate a society that is urban, stratified, administratively organized, and visibly institutional in a way later civilizations will instantly recognize. The answer, very often, is this world. Not because it appears from nowhere, but because it makes visible what earlier millennia prepared. Southern Mesopotamia becomes the place where the scattered threads are woven tightly enough to hold. Villages become cities. Shrines become powerful temple institutions. Storage becomes administration. Counting becomes writing. Local hierarchy becomes urban order. The first civilization, if one must place the title somewhere, begins to look less like a mythic dawn, and more like a hard-won concentration of all the pressures that have been building for thousands of years. And still there is nothing inevitable about it. Uruk rises in mud. Its grandeur depends on canals that clog, fields that can fail, labor that must be fed, and institutions that must constantly justify their grip on human effort. This first great urban experiment is not a stable triumph. It is a precarious achievement that may be the most important thing about it. Civilization does not begin as permanence fulfilled. It begins as a massive act of organization against instability, built in one of the most productive and demanding landscapes on Earth. The wonder is not simply that cities appear there. It is that they appear there so early, at such scale, and leave behind enough evidence for us to recognize that something entirely new in human history has taken form. Uruk does not merely grow, it overwhelms the scale people have known before. That is what makes it so important and so unsettling in the history of human society. Earlier communities gather in impressive numbers. Some build walls, some raise towers, some create dense settlements that force new kinds of social discipline. But Uruk seems to cross a threshold where growth is no longer just a matter of more houses and more fields. It becomes a matter of systems so large that no individual can see the whole of them. The city acquires a kind of mass. It pulls labor inward, pushes influence outward, and begins to function less like an enlarged village than like a machine made of human beings. Mud brick, grain, water, and belief. To stand in such a place, if one could return to it in its height, would be to feel the shock immediately. There are broad sacred precincts, monumental platforms, storehouses, workshops, walls, and open spaces shaped by institutions rather than households. There are districts whose purposes differ. There are flows of people who do not all know one another. There are deliveries arriving from fields beyond sight, perhaps from dependent villages tied into the city's orbit. There are workers shaping bricks, hauling goods, preparing textiles, managing livestock, brewing, grinding, transporting, sealing containers, tracking rations. There are priests, or administrators, or both, moving through environments designed to make power visible. The city is no longer simply inhabited, it is operated. That is one of the deepest changes urban scale produces. In a village, most relationships remain personal. Even when tense or hierarchical, people know who owns a field, who owes labor, who belongs to which household, who can be trusted, who cannot. Memory remains social and local. In Uruk, much more of life must be mediated by procedure. Goods are stored in bulk. Labor is coordinated in larger groups. Institutions need ways to monitor contributions, obligations, and access. This is why the earliest writing appears here in such a practical form. This city becomes too large to run on memory alone. It needs records, because it has become a place where strangers, subordinates, specialists, and officials must interact through systems rather than familiarity. Population size is only part of this. What matters equally is density of dependence. A city like Uruk ties together lives that would once have remained separate. Farmers on the edge of the alluvium support builders in the center. Shepherds, fishers, transport workers, craft producers, and temple laborers become parts of one wider metabolism. The urban core demands food, fuel, reeds, clay, wool, and raw materials. In return, it offers ritual centrality, storage, redistribution, specialized production, perhaps security, perhaps coercion. Scholars still debate exactly how much of this system was centrally directed and how much was more distributed across competing institutions. But the overall effect is plain. Uruk creates a social world in which scale itself becomes power. That power can be read in architecture, but also in time. The larger the city, the more daily life must submit to recurring rhythms beyond the household. Work must be organized not only by season, but by institutional need. Deliveries must arrive when expected. Laborers must be fed when assigned. Buildings must be maintained. Ritual cycles observed. Canals kept functional. Goods counted and recounted. An urban civilization runs on timing as much as on space. One lesser-known reality of the first cities is that they do not merely concentrate people physically, they synchronize them. Thousands of lives begin to move according to routines generated by larger structures, and this changes what freedom means. Uruk's monumentality is therefore more than display. The great precincts are not simply there to impress. They help create the conditions under which a population accepts, or at least learns, the reality of living within an ordered system larger than itself. A raised platform, a carefully bounded sacred zone, a monumental facade. All of these teach people where power resides. They turn administration into landscape. They make inequality feel spatially natural. This is one reason early cities matter so much in human history. They do not just house institutions. They train perception. They teach the eye to expect centrality, hierarchy, distance from power, and concentration of privilege. And still, the city cannot live off ritual alone. Uruk's size forces a practical revolution in production. Mass-produced beveled rim bowls, found in huge numbers, have fascinated archaeologists for decades. Their precise function is still debated, but they are often interpreted as containers, linked to rationing or standardized distribution, whether for grain, bread, beer, or some combination of uses. Their sheer abundance hints at a world where provisioning large groups has become routine. This is a revealing detail, because it draws the city away from abstraction and back into the body. Urban scale means feeding people at scale. It means regularized sustenance for labor that no longer operates entirely inside kin-based households. The first civilization may be remembered for temples and tablets, but it is held together just as much by bowls, bread, and measured portions. Standardization appears elsewhere too. Bricks, vessels, administrative practices, seals, and architectural forms all suggest a society increasingly comfortable with repetition under institutional control. This is not the repetition of tradition alone. It is operational repetition. The same container, the same mark, the same counted unit, the same planned space. Such regularity allows a system to expand because it reduces ambiguity. It makes people and goods more legible to the institutions that manage them. Civilization at this stage begins to see through categories. Grain becomes measurable, labor becomes allocable, containers become countable, land becomes productive territory. Human beings become participants in a civic order that can organize them at a distance. Uruk also reaches beyond itself in ways that feel startlingly early. The so-called Uruk expansion, however interpreted, suggests that this city and the culture around it are not content to remain enclosed within the southern plain. Material traits associated with Uruk appear across a broader zone, from northern Mesopotamia into neighboring regions. Some sites may have hosted southern colonists or merchant communities. Others may have adopted Uruk forms selectively for their own purposes. Scholars still debate the balance between trade, emulation, migration, and control. But even the uncertainty reveals something important. Urban civilization here is already producing a recognizable external footprint. It is creating demand, influence, and perhaps competition across a large geography. This wider reach may have been driven partly by need. Southern Mesopotamia lacks easy access to many valued materials, and large urban institutions amplify that scarcity. A city that grows to unprecedented size must secure timber, stone, metals, and other resources from beyond its immediate environment. Urbanism therefore pushes outward, not only through ambition, but through structural hunger. The city must extend networks because its own success deepens its dependence on things it cannot supply locally. This is another paradox at the heart of civilization. The greater its concentration, the wider its vulnerabilities. It is tempting to imagine that people living in Uruk understood they had entered a new age. Perhaps some did, in fragments. Perhaps they felt the difference without naming it. More likely, most experienced it as mounting obligation, more work tied to institutions, greater distance between ordinary life and concentrated authority, more visible inequality, more regulation of storage, labor, and access, more chance for opportunity and specialized roles, but also more exposure to systems that could not be escaped simply by walking away. The record does not preserve their voices directly. What it preserves are the structures within which those voices were increasingly contained. There is an irony here. Uruk is often called the first city, sometimes even the first real civilization, because it leaves evidence of extraordinary organization. Yet that evidence is strongest where institutions were strongest. Temples, administrative devices, monumental buildings, standardized goods, these survive because power produces durable traces. The lives of ordinary people are harder to recover. Their houses, tools, diet, illnesses, injuries, and labor can sometimes be glimpsed, but only partially. So the first great urban experiment reaches us through its systems more clearly than through its feelings. We know how it counted better than how it dreamed. We know how it built better than how it endured. The evidence remains incomplete, and that incompleteness is itself part of the story. Still, the city's importance is beyond dispute. Uruk demonstrates that human beings can create a settlement so large, so internally differentiated, and so institutionally organized, that it changes the scale of history. After this point, civilization is no longer a scattered potential, hidden in villages and ritual centers. It is visible. It has mass, precincts, records, labor regimes, and regional gravity. It can shape the countryside around it and link distant lands to its own needs. It can remember through clay and command through architecture. It can gather more people into one frame than earlier ages would have thought practical. And yet the shock of scale is not just triumph. It is tension, preserved in urban form. Every larger building implies greater extraction. Every stored surplus implies a system of claims. Every standardized ration implies dependence. Every outward trade link implies inward need. Uruk is magnificent, but it is also demanding. It marks the moment when civilization becomes clearly recognizable, because it is no longer local complexity alone. It is organized concentration under pressure, with enough institutional coherence to endure, and enough internal strain to require constant management. This is why Uruk remains so central to the question of firstness, not because it invented every ingredient of civilization, but because it assembled them at a scale that cannot be mistaken. It turns villages into hinterland, temples into engines, counting into writing, labor into structure, and landscape into an urban field of power. The first civilization, if there must be one place nearest the beginning, starts to look very much like this. A city so large that it creates a new human condition simply by forcing people to live within its reach. If Mesopotamia feels like the place where the city first becomes undeniable, Egypt feels like the place where power first learns to endure in stone. The Nile cuts through the desert like a long, narrow certainty, and along its banks, another early answer to the question of civilization takes form. It is not identical to the Sumerian world. It does not emerge from the same ecological pressures or political pattern. It does not scatter itself across rival city-states in quite the same way. What rises here is more linear, more centralized, more visually unified, and in some ways, more immediately legible to later ages. If southern Mesopotamia is the first great urban experiment, the Nile Valley is one of the first great demonstrations of how a river can bind landscape, kingship, labor, and belief into a civilization of extraordinary coherence. The Nile is often described as a gift, and there is truth in that old phrase, though, like all such phrases, it hides the labor behind the blessing. Each year in antiquity, the river's flood spreads across the valley and delta, laying down fertile silt and renewing agricultural land in a region otherwise bordered by severe aridity. The contrast is one of the most dramatic in the ancient world. Beyond the cultivated strip lies desert, rock, and exposure. Along the floodplain lies grain, settlement, reeds, orchards, and dense human life. This geography matters because it compresses civilization into a corridor. Egypt is not an alluvial sprawl like southern Mesopotamia. It is a river world with edges that gives it a particular kind of unity from the beginning. Yet the Nile is no automatic machine for order. The inundation must still be understood, anticipated, and lived around. A high flood can be destructive. A low flood can be disastrous. Fields must be organized according to flood recession, basin irrigation, and seasonal timing. Storage matters. Coordination matters. A bad year affects not an isolated hamlet, but a whole chain of settlements, strung along the same arterial system. What survives in the record suggests that from very early on, communities in the Nile Valley develop a strong relationship not only with agriculture and surplus, but with the recurring, temporal discipline imposed by the river. Like the people of other fertile floodplains, they learn that abundance must be managed, and that management can become authority. Pre-dynastic Egypt begins not with pyramids, but with villages and regional cultures, gradually thickening into something more integrated. In Upper Egypt especially, sites such as Nakada, Hierakonpolis, and Abydos reveal a world of growing social complexity. During the 4th millennium BCE, craft production intensifies. Long-distance exchange expands. Burials become more differentiated, with some graves richer and more elaborate than others. Symbols of prestige, ritual objects, exotic materials, and an increasingly formalized elite display suggest that hierarchy is deepening. The evidence remains incomplete, but the pattern is familiar by now. Surplus, ritual, and status are beginning to reinforce one another. The village world is giving rise to stronger centers and more pronounced inequalities. Hierakonpolis is especially revealing. Long before the full dynastic state crystallizes, it appears as a major center with elite burials, ceremonial architecture, industrial-scale brewing, and evidence of organized labor and ritual activity. This is a place where power is already learning to perform itself. Brewing on a large scale suggests provisioning beyond the household. Ceremonial spaces suggest gatherings that exceed local domestic ritual. Exotic goods imply long-distance connection. Animal remains, iconography, and elite display hint at a social order that is becoming theatrical as well as practical. Kingship is not yet fully stabilized, but some of its habits are already visible. Abydos matters for a different reason. It becomes one of the crucial burial centers of early Egyptian elites, and later of kings themselves. This concentration of prestige around the dead says something important about Egyptian civilization from the outset. In many early societies, authority depends on control of food, labor, land, and ritual. In Egypt, it also becomes intensely entangled with memory, death, and sacred continuity. The ruler is not merely a manager of canals or collector of tribute. He is positioned within a cosmic framework. The dead do not simply leave society. They are incorporated into its order, monumentalized, provisioned, and made enduring. This is one reason Egyptian civilization will become so visually powerful in the Canal archaeological record. It is obsessed from an early stage with making power survive bodily death. The process of political unification along the Nile remains one of the great turning points in ancient history. By around the late 4th millennium BCE, competing regional polities in Upper and Lower Egypt appear to be consolidating through conflict, alliance, absorption, or some mixture of all three, into a single kingdom. Tradition later credits Narmer, sometimes identified with Menes in older accounts, as the unifier of Egypt. The famous Narmer palette, with its carefully staged imagery of domination and royal symbolism, has long stood at the center of this story. Yet scholars still debate how sudden or complete this unification truly was. No single explanation fully accounts for the process. It may have been gradual, contested, and accompanied by episodes of resistance and negotiation invisible in the surviving elite record. Even so, the end result is unmistakable. Egypt emerges as one of the earliest large territorial states in the world. That is where Egypt's claim differs sharply from Mesopotamia's. In southern Mesopotamia, urbanization appears early and dramatically, but political unity remains unstable for long periods. City-states compete, overlap, rise, and fall. In Egypt, the river corridor seems to encourage a stronger early logic of centralized rule. The pharaoh becomes not one king among rivals, but the focal point of a unified land, stretching from the delta southward through the valley. Geography helps make this possible. The Nile is a natural spine. Communication is facilitated by the current and prevailing winds. The cultivated strip is relatively narrow and knowable. Deserts on either side provide both threat and protection. A kingdom organized along such a line has advantages in coherence that the open and shifting Mesopotamian plain does not easily grant. This early centralization changes everything. Administration becomes territorial rather than merely local. Taxation and labor mobilization can be imagined at the scale of a kingdom. Monument building can serve not just a city or temple precinct, but a state ideology that claims to encompass the whole land. Religious order and political order fuse in the body of the king with unusual intensity. The pharaoh is not simply divine by praise alone. He is the guarantor of Ma'at, the cosmic balance that links flood, fertility, justice, and the stability of the world. This gives Egyptian kingship a form of legitimacy, at once practical and metaphysical. A well-ordered river valley, productive fields, and a properly conducted ritual order become parts of one moral political vision. Writing emerges in this context too, though differently than in Mesopotamia. Early Egyptian writing appears by the late 4th millennium BCE, used in administrative and elite contexts, often associated with labels, ownership, offerings, and royal display. As in Sumer, writing first serves practical and institutional needs, before becoming the vessel of literature and elaborate historical memory. But Egyptian script quickly acquires an additional visual and sacred force. Hieroglyphs are not merely signs for accounting, they become part of monumental expression, bound up with image, kingship, and the durability of royal presence. Writing in Egypt is administrative, but it is also aesthetic and ceremonial, almost from the beginning, in a way that feels distinct. Then there is stone. One of the most important differences between the Egyptian and Mesopotamian records is not just political structure, but material environment. Mesopotamia builds largely in mud brick, a medium of immense flexibility but poor long-term survival. Egypt also uses mud brick extensively in domestic and many institutional contexts, yet it has access to abundant stone and develops an early appetite for using it in elite and sacred architecture. This gives Egyptian civilization an outsized afterlife in modern imagination. Later pyramids, temples, mastabas, statues, and carved reliefs survive with a dramatic pageantry that the mud brick cities of Sumer rarely can. The durability of Egyptian power is therefore partly archaeological luck, but also partly a deliberate cultural choice to build for permanence. That permanence is already visible in the early dynastic period, before the Pyramid Age fully begins. Royal tombs at Abydos and Saqqara, administrative centers, ceilings, labels, and increasingly formalized iconography show a civilization that is not improvising its period. Legitimacy from scratch. It is systematizing it. Officials emerge. Regions are organized. Royal names are inscribed. Elite burial becomes an apparatus of state display. The kingdom starts to see itself as continuous, ordered, and sanctioned. What survives in the record suggests a remarkable confidence for so early a state, though beneath that confidence there must also have been fragility, coercion, labor demands, and regional tensions less visible in official imagery. One lesser-known but telling feature of early Egypt is how much its coherence depends on repeated performance. Unification is not a one-time achievement. It must be restated in ritual, image, taxation, mobility, elite appointments, and control of agricultural production. The famous image of the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, joined under one ruler, is not just a celebration of success. It is a continual political act. The state must keep imagining itself whole in order to remain whole. This is true of all early civilizations, but Egypt makes the process unusually explicit. Its art, titulary, ceremonial objects, and burial practices all work to stabilize a single vision of order over a long, narrow landscape that could easily have fractured. So, can Egypt be called the first civilization? Depending on the definition, it can certainly be called one of the earliest and one of the most compelling, if one emphasizes enduring territorial kingship, centralized administration, monumental projection of state power, and a river-based agricultural order bound tightly to divine rule. Egypt is a formidable claimant. If one emphasizes earliest large-scale urbanism or the very first writing, Mesopotamia still usually comes first. But the distinction should not conceal the deeper point. Egypt is not a secondary imitation, waiting for Sumer to show the way. It is a parallel early solution to the same broad human problem, how to turn floodplain abundance into durable political and symbolic order. The Nile makes that order feel almost serene when viewed from a distance. Later monuments reinforce the illusion. But early Egyptian civilization, like every civilization, is built from pressure. The pressure of timing the flood, of organizing labor, of holding regional elites within a common system, of extracting surplus without destroying legitimacy, of embedding political power in cosmic necessity. It appears smoother than Mesopotamia, because its ideology of unity is smoother, and its geography is more disciplined. Yet beneath the polished stone and royal symbols lies the same hard foundation seen elsewhere. In the ancient world, grain, storage, administration, ritual, hierarchy, and the immense labor of persuading a population that the system above them is as natural as the river itself. That is why Egypt matters so much in the search for beginnings. It proves that civilization does not have only one early shape. The first recognizable civilizations do not all emerge as noisy clusters of competing cities. Some emerge as corridors of order. Some centralize early. Some monumentalize memory more aggressively. Some make the ruler the axis on which land and cosmos both turn. Along the Nile, civilization becomes not just a city grown large, but a kingdom stretched along water, held together by flood, kingship, and the promise that as long as the river rises and the rituals hold, the world itself remains in balance. Once Mesopotamia and Egypt enter the frame, the temptation is to let the question close. The first civilization, it seems, must belong to one of them. They are old enough, visible enough, and richly documented enough to dominate the imagination. Their cities, rulers, scripts, temples, tombs, and administrative systems fit the category so comfortably that everything else risks being treated as a footnote or a delay. But the deeper one looks across the ancient world, the less satisfying that tidy conclusion becomes. Other societies in other landscapes are also assembling complexity at extraordinary depth and scale. Some build cities without obvious kings. Some raise monuments without writing. Some create planned urban life, so sophisticated that later ages still struggle to explain its political shape. The title of first begins to splinter, because different worlds arrive at different forms of civilization by different paths. The Indus Valley is the most obvious and most unsettling of these alternatives. By the 3rd millennium BCE, the civilization often called Harappan, after one of its first excavated sites, spreads across an enormous region of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. Its great cities, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa among them, display a level of planning that immediately commands respect. Streets run in ordered grids. Drainage systems are remarkably advanced. Brick sizes are standardized across large distances. Storage, craft production, water management, and urban layout all suggest disciplined coordination. If civilization means the ability to organize large populations into durable, materially coherent urban systems, the Indus world is plainly inside the circle. And yet it is different in ways that keep disturbing familiar expectations. There are no obvious pharaohs here, no clear palace complexes towering above the city, no royal inscriptions triumphantly telling later ages who is in charge. The script remains undeciphered, assuming it encodes language in the way many scholars suspect. Seals, symbols, weights, craft traditions, and city plans survive, but the voices behind them remain largely silent. This silence matters because it prevents the usual story from hardening too quickly. We can see administration without hearing its orders. We can see standardization without fully identifying the institution that imposed it. We can see urban discipline without clearly locating a king at its center. That makes the Indus civilization one of the most fascinating claimants in the entire debate. It seems to possess many of the classic marks of civilization: cities, craft specialization, long-distance trade, standard weights and measures, sophisticated water and waste systems, and a wide cultural coherence across a huge territory. Yet it presents them in a form less theatrical than Egypt, and less textually revealing than Mesopotamia. Scholars still debate whether political authority was highly centralized, distributed among elites, embedded in mercantile or ritual institutions, or structured in some way that does not fit the old models comfortably. No single explanation fully accounts for the evidence. The result is both frustrating and illuminating. Civilization, the Indus suggests, need not always announce itself through the same monuments of power. Its urbanism is in some respects startlingly mature. Mohenjo-Daro, in particular, has become almost emblematic of a different way of being ancient and complex. There are carefully laid bricks, wells, bathing facilities, drainage channels, and distinct architectural zones. Some structures, like the so-called Great Bath, imply ritual or communal significance, though interpretation remains debated. Large storage-like buildings have often been called granaries, though even that label is not beyond dispute. The point is not that every feature has been perfectly understood. The point is that this is clearly a civilization-scale landscape, one built by people able to standardize materials, regulate space, and coordinate large labor investments across generations. Trade extends its reach further. Indus goods and seals appear in Mesopotamian contexts, where the distant land of Meluha is often thought to refer to the Indus region. This contact reminds us that the early civilizations are not isolated candles flickering in separate darkness. They are increasingly aware of one another, whether directly or through intermediaries. Goods, ideas, motifs, and demands move between them. The ancient world is beginning to knit together at its edges. A civilization's claim to importance is therefore not only internal, it is also visible in the way it enters wider systems of exchange. Then there is Norte Chico, or Caral Supe, on the coast of present-day Peru, a society so early and so unusual that it often feels like an argument against any narrow definition. Flourishing in the late 4th and early 3rd millennia BCE, roughly comparable in antiquity to some of the earliest Old World civilizations. It presents monumental architecture, platform mounds, large public spaces, and evidence of organized labor on a significant scale. Yet it does so in a world with no confirmed writing system in the familiar sense, and without the same urban signature associated with Mesopotamia. For a long time, its very existence received far less attention than it deserved, partly because it did not fit the old story centered on river valleys of the Old World. Norte Chico matters because it reveals that civilization-like complexity can arise in strikingly different environmental and social settings. Along the Peruvian coast, communities seem to have combined maritime resources with irrigated agriculture, weaving together a regional system that could support labor mobilization and monumental construction. Scholars still debate aspects of its economy, especially the relative importance of farming versus fishing, but the broader picture is increasingly clear. Here is an early complex society with large ceremonial centers and coordinated production, emerging independently of the better-known centers in Africa and Asia. That fact alone should make anyone cautious about reducing civilization to a single invention in a single place. Early China offers another path, though one unfolding somewhat later than the earliest. Mesopotamian and Egyptian formations, by the late 3rd and early 2nd millennia BCE, and with roots stretching into earlier Neolithic cultures such as Yangshao, Longshan, and others. Northern and eastern China are producing complex societies marked by walled settlements, craft specialization, elite burials, ritual sophistication, and eventually dynastic political structures. Longshan in particular, with its immense earthworks, water management, elite jade culture, and regional integration, has forced scholars to reconsider just how early state-level complexity appears in East Asia. It does not usually enter the first civilization debate as the primary winner, largely because its fullest state formations emerge later than Sumer and Egypt, but it still broadens the picture. Civilization is not a miracle granted once. It is a recurring human response under certain pressures, though always shaped by local conditions. Even within Southwest Asia, the older map of firstness becomes less secure when one looks beyond the most famous southern Mesopotamian cities. Northern Mesopotamia, the Iranian Plateau, the Levant, and Anatolia all contribute elements that complicate any claim of pure origin. Ritual centers, exchange networks, metallurgy, settlement hierarchies, and symbolic systems develop across wide regions. The South may offer the earliest widely accepted fusion of city, writing, and large-scale administration, but it is nourished by broader worlds. Civilizations are rarely born in isolation. They crystallize out of zones of interaction where people, goods, and techniques have already been moving for generations. One of the most surprising truths, then, is that different ancient societies can plausibly claim to be first in different categories. Mesopotamia may be first in widely accepted full urbanism with writing. Egypt may be first in durable territorial kingship on a monumental scale. The Indus may represent one of the earliest and most sophisticated examples of planned urban life, with sanitation and standardization spread across vast distances. Norte Chico may be among the earliest cases of monument-building complex society in the Americas, emerging independently and astonishingly early. Early China shows that large-scale complexity takes root in yet another ecological and cultural setting, with its own sequence of thresholds. This is not a trick of classification. It reflects something real about the ancient world. Civilization is not one trait, but a bundle of traits, and bundles can be tied in different orders. One society may develop cities before strong monarchy. Another may centralize kingship before dense urban competition. Another may standardize space and craft without leaving deciphered texts. Another may build large ceremonial centers from regional cooperation before anything like Later, imperial bureaucracy appears. The evidence remains incomplete, and modern labels often flatten variation into familiar narratives. But what survives in the record suggests that human beings discovered several ways to become civilizational. There is also the problem of survival. Mesopotamia and Egypt dominate partly because their evidence has survived in striking forms, and because generations of scholars have excavated, translated, and retold their stories. Other regions suffered different preservation conditions, different research histories, and at times, different levels of global attention. A civilization that leaves stone monuments and readable inscriptions is always easier to celebrate than one whose records remain undeciphered, or whose architecture survives only in eroded platforms. This does not make the latter less important. It only makes them harder to narrate in the old, confident style. So the map of early civilization begins to resemble not a race with a single winner, but a widening constellation. Different centers brighten at different moments. Some are brighter because their evidence is louder. Some remain dimmer because time or chance has muted them. Yet together they make the same point. Human societies do not climb one ladder in one place and then teach the rest of the world how to be complex. They repeatedly discover, under different skies and beside different waters, that settled abundance, coordination, memory, ritual, and inequality can be woven into systems large enough to change history. That is why these other claimants matter so much. They do not overthrow Mesopotamia or Egypt. They prevent them from becoming too simple. They remind us that firstness is rarely singular in human history, especially when the category being measured contains so many moving parts. The earliest civilizations are not copies of one original. They are parallel answers to a set of recurring questions: how to feed many, how to organize labor, how to bind strangers into one order, how to make authority visible, how to remember beyond living memory, how to turn a landscape into a durable human world. Once that becomes clear, the old question changes shape again. It is no longer just who came first. It is first in what sense, by what evidence, and according to which threshold. And the answer, increasingly, is that the ancient world was crowded with beginnings. If cities are the body of civilization, writing is often treated as its memory. That assumption runs deep. People who leave inscriptions, tablets, labels, records, and named rulers seem easier to place inside history than those who leave only walls, bones, tools, and silence. Writing appears to solve the problem of uncertainty. It gives dates, names, taxes, offerings, victories, lineages. It lets institutions outlive the people who first built them. It allows orders to travel, debts to persist, myths to be repeated, and rulers to speak beyond death. It is no surprise that many definitions of civilization place writing near the center, yet the closer one looks, the more complicated that confidence becomes. Writing transforms civilization, certainly, but whether it defines it is another matter. The earliest writing does not begin in grandeur. It begins in pressure. In southern Mesopotamia during the late 4th millennium BCE, the growth of large institutions, stored surplus, labor obligations, and administrative complexity creates a problem that memory alone cannot easily manage. Tokens, sealings, and accounting devices have already existed in earlier forms. Goods can be counted through objects and impressions, but as the city grows, and as temple or institutional households absorb more labor and resources, the need for more durable and more flexible record-keeping becomes harder to ignore. Clay tablets bearing signs emerge from this world, not as literature, but as administration. Civilization first writes to count. This detail matters because it strips some of the later romance away and reveals the machinery underneath. Writing is often imagined as a sudden flowering of thought, the dawn of history, in a noble intellectual sense. In reality, its earliest surviving uses are often dry, repetitive, and practical. Lists of commodities, measures of grain, allocations of labor, containers, animals, offerings. This does not make the invention less astonishing. it makes it more revealing. Civilization does not first write to reflect on itself. It writes to manage itself. The city becomes too large, its obligations too layered, its institutions too durable, to rely only on spoken memory and mutual recognition. Marks pressed into clay become a new form of control. Once that threshold is crossed, however, the consequences reach far beyond bookkeeping. A record can travel across time in a way memory cannot. It can survive the death of the person who made it. It can be checked, cited, stored, revised, accumulated. Administration becomes less personal and more institutional, because the account outlasts the accountant. This matters enormously in any large society. A king may die, a steward may be replaced, a temple official may fall from favor, but the tablet remains. The written sign gives the institution a longer life than the individual. It allows civilization to grow more abstract, and abstraction is power. That is one reason writing so often seems inseparable from the rise of the state. A state must see. It must know who owes, who stores, who serves, who belongs, who can be summoned, what has been collected, what remains in reserve. The more territory and population a political order tries to organize, the more valuable some stable information system becomes. Yet the relationship is not perfectly simple. Some early states rely heavily on oral systems, visual symbols, personal oversight, and local memory, longer than modern people often assume. Conversely, writing can appear in narrow administrative or elite contexts before it fully permeates society. The evidence remains incomplete, and the spread of literacy in ancient civilizations is usually much narrower than the grand monuments later suggest. Egypt offers a parallel but distinct case. Early hieroglyphic writing appears by the late 4th millennium BCE, associated with labels, ownership marks, royal display, and administrative contexts. Like Mesopotamian writing, it begins close to power and institutional need. But in Egypt, script very quickly acquires a different public presence. Hieroglyphs are not only practical marks, they are images arranged with visual care and sacred force. They attach themselves to kingship, tombs, and ceremonial permanence in ways that make writing part of the architecture of authority. A name inscribed on stone is not merely information, it is continuation, it is survival. Writing in Egypt helps turn rule into memory, and memory into sacred durability. This is where the relationship between writing and civilization becomes especially, interesting. Writing does not merely record power, it amplifies it. A ruler whose deeds are inscribed is harder to forget. A temple whose offerings are catalogued is easier to manage. A boundary that is named and marked acquires sharper force. A myth written down can be repeated with unusual fidelity, though never perfect fidelity, across generations. Law, where written, gains an aura different from custom alone. Lists of kings can invent continuity, even where the real past has been fractured. Bureaucracy can expand, because its memory is no longer trapped inside individual minds. In this sense, writing is not just a symptom of civilization, it is one of the tools by which civilization stabilizes itself. And yet the category begins to wobble again the moment one looks at the Indus world. Here is a civilization by almost any material standard. Large cities, standardization, exchange networks, specialized production, region-wide coherence, sophisticated water systems. There are signs on seals and objects, repeated enough to suggest some meaningful symbolic or linguistic system, but the script remains undeciphered, and the inscriptions are short. If writing in the full sense existed there, it has not yet yielded its grammar to modern scholarship. Does that uncertainty place the Indus outside civilization? Reveals instead how dangerous it is to let one surviving technology become the sole surviving technology, become the sole surviving technology, become the sole gatekeeper of human complexity. The same lesson emerges even more sharply in societies where no convincing writing system appears at all, yet large-scale organization clearly does. Norte Chico in ancient Peru remains one of the most striking examples. Monumental architecture, coordinated labor, regional integration, and long-lasting ceremonial centers appear there, without anything like cuneiform or hieroglyphic record-keeping, preserved in the usual way. Later Andean civilizations will develop other tools for managing information, most famously the quipu, knotted cords used for accounting, and perhaps more. These systems remind us that memory can be organized materially, without looking like script on clay or stone. Scholars still debate the full informational range of such devices, but the broader implication is clear. Writing is powerful, yes, but it is not the only road to complexity. Even within literate civilizations, writing is rarely democratic at the start. Most people do not write. Most people may never read a formal text. Writing often belongs first to scribes, administrators, priests, royal courts, and specialized professionals trained in difficult systems. Literacy is labor-intensive. Signs must be learned. Materials must be prepared. Archives must be kept. A civilization can therefore be thoroughly shaped by writing, even when the overwhelming majority of its population encounters it only indirectly. A farmer may never read a tablet, yet live under obligations created, tracked, and enforced through written records. A laborer may never inscribe a name, yet build monuments meant to preserve a ruler's written claims forever. One lesser-known truth is that early writing often obscures as much as it reveals, because it begins close to institutions. It preserves their priorities better than ordinary experience. We know what rulers wanted remembered. We know what administrations needed counted. We know which gods received offerings, and which officials were important enough to name. We know less about the unrecorded tensions beneath those surfaces: resentment, fatigue, private belief, minor negotiations, unspoken habits, and the countless lives that pass through the system without leaving formal words behind. Writing gives civilization a memory, but it is a selective memory. It is rarely neutral. It often favors the center over the margin, the powerful over the ordinary, the durable institution over the passing individual. This is why archaeology remains indispensable even in literate worlds. Tablets and inscriptions may speak, but pottery, skeletons, refuse pits, broken tools, house plans, and botanical remains correct them constantly. A king may boast of abundance, while bones show nutritional stress. Administrative texts may list rations, while settlement patterns reveal contraction. Monumental inscriptions may celebrate cosmic order, while fortifications and destruction layers hint at conflict. No single explanation fully accounts for early civilization, if one listens only to what it said about itself. Writing is one witness among many, and often a partial one. Still, it would be wrong to minimize the magnitude of its change. Once a civilization writes, history begins to accumulate differently. The past can be curated, genealogies can be lengthened, precedents can be invoked, instructions can be transmitted across distance and time. Myths can be standardized enough to become instruments of cultural continuity. Writing enlarges the reach of dead voices. It lets the absent command the present. In administrative life, this means a system can function with greater scale and consistency. In political life, it means authority can be projected beyond immediate presence. In religion, it means sacred formulas and names can acquire extraordinary durability. In culture, it means memory no longer depends entirely on performance, though performance never disappears. So, should writing define civilization? The case for yes is understandable. Writing makes a huge difference. It strengthens states, archives economies, preserves myths, and gives modern scholars their clearest view into ancient institutions. It is one of the most transformative thresholds human societies ever cross. But the case for no is stronger once the full ancient landscape is kept in view. Civilizational complexity clearly exists in places where writing is absent, uncertain, short, undeciphered, or narrowly confined. Cities can function, monuments can rise, labor can be organized, trade can span great distances, and power can harden without abundant readable text. What writing does is not create civilization from nothing. It changes the scale, durability, and self-consciousness of civilizations already underway. Perhaps the better way to see it is this. Agriculture anchors people. Surplus frees and binds them. Cities concentrate them. Hierarchy orders them. Writing remembers them, or at least remembers the system that governs them. It is one threshold among several, and one that matters immensely, because it allows the others to persist more forcefully. But it is not the only threshold, and it is not always the first crossed. The oldest civilizations are not simply the first to write. They are the first to build durable worlds, larger than kinship and memory alone. Writing strengthens those worlds. It does not always inaugurate them. That is why the earliest tablets and inscriptions feel so moving, even when they are nothing. More poetic than rations or labels. They stand at the moment when civilization begins to externalize its own mind. Grain, labor, and offerings are no longer only experienced. They are recorded. The city begins to speak to itself in marks. The state begins to remember what it has done. The ruler begins to push his name against time, and yet beyond the archive, fields still flood, laborers still strain, households still cook and bury, and endure, as they always have. Writing transforms the upper structure of civilization, but it rests on the same old human foundation. Bodies, seasons, dependence, and the hope that what is stored, whether in granary or clay, will last long enough to carry life through the next away. Uncertainty. By the time civilization becomes visible in the record, it is already doing more than feeding people and housing them. It is arranging them. It is deciding who stands closer to the gods, who commands labor, who stores grain, who records obligations, who serves, who obeys, and who is remembered after death. Cities do not hold together through population alone. They require binding forces, and in the earliest civilizations, those forces are rarely separate. Religion, administration, surplus, ritual, hierarchy, and coercion overlap so thoroughly that trying to isolate one from the others can become misleading. Temples are not just sacred. Palaces are not just political. Storehouses are not just economic. Civilization begins to work when these institutions reinforce one another, strongly enough to make social order feel inevitable. Temples stand near the beginning of this process for a reason. In early Mesopotamia especially, the temple appears not merely as a religious center, but as one of the earliest great organizers of collective life. It receives offerings, controls land, stores goods, manages labor, stages ritual, and gives visible form to a world in which fertility, divine favor, and institutional order are inseparable. A harvest is not just weather and work. It is a sign that the gods have not withdrawn their support. A city's prosperity is not merely practical success. It is proof, or at least the claim, that the sacred center continues to mediate between human need and cosmic stability. That claim matters because it can turn obedience into piety. Labor done for the temple is not just labor extracted by an institution. It can be framed as service to the divine order that keeps the fields fertile and the city safe. Grain stored in temple facilities is not merely wealth held out of reach of ordinary households. It can be presented as an offering, a reserve, a duty. This is one of the great civilizational innovations, and one of the most consequential. Power learns to speak in sacred language. Once that happens, hierarchy becomes harder to challenge, because it is no longer only social, it is cosmological. Yet religion does not explain everything by itself. Early civilizations are full of practical demands that no ritual can solve without. Organization. Canals need clearing. Walls need repair. surplus must be gathered, measured, stored, and redistributed. Workshops require raw materials. Labor gangs must be fed. Dependent villages must remain tied to the center. Roads or river routes must stay functional. Disputes over land and obligation cannot all be settled through household custom once populations become large and relationships impersonal. Administration enters here, not as some cold, late addition, but the temple official, the steward, the scribe, the overseer, and later the royal officer, all tamp, with joined steins, withdrew. Become custodians of a new order, in which practical management and sacred legitimacy continuously support one another. This fusion is why early states can appear so total when viewed from a distance. The ruler is not only a leader, he is a pivot between worlds. In Egypt, this becomes especially explicit. The pharaoh does not merely reign. He maintains ma'at, the balance that keeps the cosmos, the river, the land, and society in proper alignment. To obey him is not simply to submit to power, it is to participate in the maintenance of order itself. That ideology does not erase coercion, of course. It dignifies it. Labor diverted to monument building, grain collected as tax, regional elites folded into royal authority. All can be justified as part of sustaining the world's proper form. Mesopotamia often appears less unified than Egypt, and for much of its history it is. Competing cities, rival dynasties, overlapping institutions, and fluctuating political control make the landscape more fractured. Yet here, too, the same pattern is visible. The city god, the temple precinct, the administrative household, and later the palace, do not operate in isolation from one another. They create a web of legitimacy, in which divine patronage and material authority become difficult to untangle. A ruler who can claim the favor of the city's god is stronger. A temple that can command labor and land is more than sacred space. A palace that redistributes wealth, wages war, and sponsors ritual becomes a node where violence, abundance, and belief converge. The question scholars still debate is which force comes first. Does religion generate hierarchy by providing the symbolic framework within which elites justify control, or does material inequality generate priesthoods and monumental ritual as ways of stabilizing unequal systems? The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the earliest civilizations. In some cases, ritual architecture appears early enough to suggest that ceremonial life is central from the outset. In others, intensifying control over food production and labor seems to push institutions towards sacralization as they grow. Most likely, the process is reciprocal. People obey institutions more readily when those institutions appear sacred, and sacred institutions become more powerful when they control real resources. This reciprocity leaves traces everywhere. Monumental precincts imply not only belief, but organized labor. Elite burials imply not only status, but the ability to command goods and remembrance beyond the household level. Administrative records imply not only storage, but categories of people and things that can be controlled at scale. Even city layout can reveal social ranking. Who lives near the sacred center? Who occupies larger houses? Who works in specialized districts? Who is buried with prestige goods, and who is not? The ruins do not always speak plainly, but again and again, they suggest that civilization is not just concentration of population, It is concentration of asymmetry. That asymmetry hardens through daily life once specialists appear. Not everyone has the same relationship to production. Some people farm, some supervise, some record, some conduct ritual, some craft luxury goods for elites. Some serve institutional households where their labor is allocated rather than self-directed. Some are attached to palaces or temples. Some may be dependent, indebted, or unfree, in ways that later legal systems will make clearer. The first civilizations are rarely worlds of equal citizens. They are layered societies, in which difference becomes structural. A person is born into a household, but increasingly also into a rank, a duty, a proximity to power that may be difficult to escape. One lesser-known aspect of this development is how much early civilization relies on spectacle. Monumentality is not only practical or sacred, it is pedagogical. It teaches people what power looks like: a towering platform, a decorated precinct, a royal tomb, a ceremonial procession, a carefully bounded sacred space. All of these make hierarchy visible and therefore more imaginable as the natural order of things. This matters in societies too large to be governed by personal familiarity alone. A peasant may never meet the king. A laborer may never speak to a high priest. But they can see the temple. They can see the tomb. They can see the goods flowing into the institution and the rituals flowing out of it. Architecture becomes argument. Control also depends on measurement. To rule many people, institutions must simplify them. Land becomes plots. Harvest becomes units. Workers become labor groups. Offerings become quotas. Livestock become counts. This is why accounting, sealing, and standardized containers matter so much. They are the tools by which complexity becomes manageable from above. In one sense, they are marvels of organization. In another, they are instruments of reduction. A living person with family, grief, skill, and private loyalties becomes part of a category that a system can assign rations to, tax, move, or punish. Civilization advances by increasing legibility, and legibility is not an innocent process. None of this means early civilizations are held together by fear alone. They also create real benefits. Larger institutions can store food against famine, coordinate irrigation, mobilize defenses, sponsor craft traditions, build durable ritual centers, and establish long-distance exchange that enriches urban life. A temple may redistribute grain in hard times. A centralized kingdom may reduce local warfare or standardize administration in ways that stabilize production. A city can provide opportunity for specialists, traders, and artisans that village life cannot. The problem is not that civilization is secretly only oppression. The problem is that its benefits and burdens are never evenly distributed, and its most stable institutions often depend on convincing the majority that inequality is either wholly necessary or both. This is especially clear in labor organization. The monuments of early civilization do not rise through vague collective enthusiasm. They require planning, extraction, provisioning, and discipline. Workers must be assembled, fed, directed, and often housed. Some may be seasonal laborers fulfilling obligations. Some may be attached dependents. Some may be elites managing crews rather than participating directly. However, the details vary. The principle is the same. Civilization turns human effort into visible structure through systems that can command more work than the household alone could ever mobilize. Every great building is therefore a social diagram. It shows not just what people believed, but how many could be made to act together under authority. Authority, once established, tends to reproduce itself through memory. Kings commission inscriptions. Temples preserve traditions. Elite burials declare rank across generations. Dynasties compose origin stories. The first civilizations do not merely control the present. They begin to curate the past in support of the present order. A ruler is linked to divine ancestors. A city is presented as eternally favored. A kingdom is imagined as the natural form of the land. Scholars still debate the precise origins of many such traditions, but the pattern is unmistakable. Power is strongest when it can persuade people that it has always been there. That is why temples, elites, and control belong together in the story of first civilizations. They are not separate chapters. They are the structure. Civilization emerges when a society becomes large enough that personal ties are no longer sufficient, rich enough that surplus can support institutions above the household, and unequal enough that someone must justify why some command while others serve. Religion offers meaning. Administration offers tools. Elites offer continuity. Labor offers substance. Together they create systems capable of enduring beyond individual lifetimes and shaping landscapes on a scale earlier communities could never manage. But that endurance has a price. The same systems that produce writing, monuments, law, and statecraft also narrow freedom for many of the people living under them. They demand labor, tribute, obedience, and belief. They take the uncertainties of nature and convert them into the certainties of hierarchy. The village asks people to remain. Civilization asks them to belong to something larger that may not know their names. That is the bargain at its heart, and from the very beginning it is both astonishing and uneasy. The ruins never answer as cleanly as the question demands. That is one of the first things archaeology teaches, and one of the last things people want to hear. A city buried in dust looks decisive from above. Walls outline neighborhoods. Platforms rise from the plain. Graves yield ornaments, bones, seals, pottery, and tools. Tablets survive in ash. Canals leave faint scars across old floodplains. It is tempting to imagine that once enough earth has been removed, the beginning of civilization will stand there plainly exposed, like a foundation stone with a date carved into it. But ruins do not work that way. They do not preserve the past whole. They preserve fragments according to accident, chemistry, climate, violence, and time. And from those fragments, scholars build the earliest chapters of civilization with remarkable care and unavoidable uncertainty. Mud brick is one of the great paradoxes of early history. It builds the first cities and then conspires with rain, flood, wind, and neglect to erase them. Whole neighborhoods can collapse back into mounds that are almost indistinguishable from the soil around them. Walls melt, thresholds blur, roofs vanish completely. What remains is not a city waiting politely underground, but a compressed and damaged archive. Each occupation layer is the residue of countless ordinary acts: cooking, storing, discarding, rebuilding, mourning, repairing, sweeping, burning fuel, shaping clay, breaking vessels, trampling floors. Archaeology recovers civilization not through one grand discovery, but through the patient reading of those accumulations. That reading begins with context. A pot means little by itself. A pot found in a storage room, beside ceilings, grinding stones, charred grain, and administrative debris, begins to suggest a system. A burial means little alone. A burial placed beneath a house floor, surrounded by certain goods, and repeated according to a local pattern, begins to speak about ancestry, domestic ritual, and social ranking. A fragment of wall means little alone. A repeated pattern of walls, aligned with lanes or courtyards, and rebuilt over generations, begins to reveal a settlement structure. Civilization is rarely found in single objects. It is found in relationships between them. Pottery is one of the most humble and most powerful of these clues. Broken ceramics survive where wood and textiles perish. Their shapes, fabrics, firing styles, painted designs, and distribution patterns allow archaeologists to trace exchange, chronology, household habits, and sometimes rank. A standardized vessel can imply organized production. A certain decorative style can mark regional identity or elite taste. Mass-produced bowls in an institutional setting may point toward rationing systems or labor management. This is why pottery matters so much in the story of first civilizations. It records not only what people used, but how far a society had moved toward repetition, planning, and controlled distribution. Then there are seals, small enough to sit in the palm, that carry the weight of entire institutions. A seal pressed into clay on a container or door fastening suggests ownership, authorization, accountability, controlled access. Cylinder seals in Mesopotamia, stamp seals in the Indus world, and other marking devices elsewhere all hint at societies concerned with regulating movement and validating claims. These are not glamorous objects at first glance, but they belong to a major transformation. A world of face-to-face familiarity is giving way to one in which goods and obligations travel through systems that need formal signs of trust and control. Bones speak too, though in a quieter voice. Human skeletons reveal age, disease, injuries, nutritional stress, repetitive labor, burial treatment, and sometimes migration through isotopic analysis. Animal bones show diet, herd management, hunting pressure, ritual selection, and economic priorities. Botanical remains, seeds, phytoliths, pollen, charred grains, reveal what was cultivated, stored, consumed, and perhaps lost in fire. Together, these traces allow archaeology to reconstruct entire food systems. A civilization is not only its monuments, it is its calories, what people ate, how reliably they ate, and who ate better than others, are among the most revealing facts of all. This can produce startling corrections to older views. A civilization celebrated in texts for abundance may leave bodies marked by strain and malnutrition. A monumental center imagined as purely sacred may prove to have been deeply entangled in redistribution and production. A city described as sudden and revolutionary may reveal beneath it a long local sequence of smaller settlements indicating gradual growth rather than abrupt invention. Scholars still debate many such cases, because the evidence rarely points in only one direction. No single explanation fully accounts for a site, once all its layers, objects, ecofacts, and architectural phases are taken seriously. Settlement layers are especially important in the search for beginnings. One tell across Southwest Asia and beyond. Centuries or millennia of repeated occupation create artificial mounds built by human life itself. Each layer is a record of staying, rebuilding, and changing. One period may show modest houses and household storage. A later one may reveal larger buildings, public structures, craft areas, formal courtyards, or defensive works. Step by step, the mound preserves not a moment of civilizational birth, but a sequence of thresholds crossed over time. This is often where the popular imagination struggles most. There is rarely a clean line, where one day there is a village, and the next, a civilization. The mound shows instead a long accumulation of decisions that only later appear revolutionary. Even destruction can be informative. Burned layers, toppled walls, smashed vessels left in place, weapons, abandoned tools, an interrupted rebuilding, all can signal conflict, abandonment, accidental fire, or some other sharp break. But archaeologists have learned to be careful. Not every burned level means invasion. Not every collapsed wall means catastrophe. Mud brick buildings collapse naturally, if neglected. Fire can spread through crowded settlements without war. Objects may be broken through routine use, ritual deposition, or later disturbance. The record is eloquent, but it is also treacherous. One lesser-known feature of archaeological interpretation is how often the most dramatic story is the least secure. Burials present another complication. They are among the richest sources of information, yet they show the living arranging the dead according to meaning, not objective social diagrams. A lavish burial may indicate wealth, rank, ritual importance, or special circumstance, but it does not automatically map a whole society. Conversely, a modest burial does not prove equality. The evidence remains incomplete because burial is performance as much as reflection. Still, patterns matter. Repeated differences in grave goods, grave architecture, body treatment, and cemetery layout can reveal social stratification emerging over time. In early civilizations, the dead often show hierarchy before written texts explain it. The archaeology of ordinary life may be the most revealing of all. Paths, refuse dumps, worn thresholds, spindle walls, grindstones, children's burials, yacht repaired walls, patched floors, cooking pots blackened by use. These small traces anchor a civilization in daily repetition, rather than monumental abstraction. They remind us that the first cities are lived in by people who still wake hungry, carry water, mend tools, grieve children, nurse injuries, and worry about the next season. Without these traces, civilization can appear as though it were built only by institutions. With them, the system becomes human again, though not always kindly so. The Indus civilization shows how much archaeology can know without a readable archive. Its planned streets, drains, standardized bricks, craft quarters, seals, weights, wells, and regional consistency all speak powerfully, even in the absence of deciphered texts. In some ways, this is an ideal reminder that civilization is legible materially before it is legible verbally. A city can reveal governance through its drainage. A society can reveal standardization through its bricks. Exchange can be seen in materials carried over distance. Authority can be inferred from layout, repetition, and controlled production, even when no king has yet introduced himself by name. At the same time, archaeology cannot answer everything. It can reveal that a large building existed, but not always whether it was a temple, storehouse, palace, or some hybrid unfamiliar to modern categories. It can show differential diet, but not always the exact rules that produced it. It can detect long-distance trade, but not always whether that trade was state-controlled, merchant-driven, ritualized, or opportunistic. It can uncover signs on seals, but if the script resists decipherment, entire dimensions of meaning remain closed. The silence of ruins is not empty. It is selective. This selectivity is intensified by preservation itself. Dry climates preserve different materials than wet ones. Floodplains can bury ancient settlements beneath meters of alluvium, hiding them almost completely. Rising seas have drowned coastal zones, where some early communities may once have flourished. Later construction destroys earlier layers. Looting removes objects from context, turning evidence into spectacle, and stripping it of much of its value. Research history matters too. Some regions were excavated early and often, others late and unevenly. Some narratives became famous because empires and museums favored them. Others remained obscure because they fit less comfortably into the classic story of civilization's birth. So what do the ruins really reveal? They reveal process more than proclamation. They reveal concentration before they reveal kings. They reveal inequality before they reveal law codes. They reveal storage, standardization, and institutional space before they reveal ideology in words. They reveal that civilization is built from repeated acts of organization, and that those acts leave physical signatures, even when names are lost. They also reveal how much is missing. Great mounds and shattered precincts are not complete books. They are torn pages, and yet there is something extraordinary in how much can still be recovered. A seed trapped in ancient ash can testify to farming strategies. A residue inside a vessel can hint at beer, oil, or grain. Microscopic wear on teeth can reflect diet. Isotopes in bone can suggest migration or weaning patterns. Satellite imagery can trace ancient canals and buried settlement networks invisible from the ground. Remote sensing can reveal city plans beneath sand or field. Archaeology has become, in this sense, a science of restoring whispers to ruined landscapes. It cannot make the past whole again, but it can show that the first civilizations were not legends descending fully formed from myth. They were material worlds, structured and fragile, whose remains still carry the imprint of how they worked. That imprint is enough to change the question. The ruins do not identify a single first civilization with perfect finality. What they do reveal is the architecture of emergence. Villages thickening into centers, storage becoming institutional, houses giving way to precincts, burials showing rank, seals showing control, pottery showing standardization, bones showing labor, and layers showing time, compressed by permanence. Civilization enters the world not as a declaration, but as an accumulation visible in mud, ash, brick, and broken things. The ruins tell us that much with great clarity. What they do not tell us, and perhaps never fully can, is where the story began in its most absolute sense, that remains partly buried, partly washed away, and partly lost in all the lives that built the first civilizations, without ever imagining they were first at all. There is a deeper problem that lingers beneath all the evidence, and it has less to do with what has been found than with what has not. The earliest civilizations do not simply lie waiting to be uncovered. Many of them are gone in ways that leave little trace at all. Entire landscapes have shifted. Rivers have moved. Coastlines have drowned. Settlements have been buried beneath later cities or erased by time so completely that even their absence is difficult to recognize. The beginning of civilization is not just hidden. In many cases, it may be permanently lost. This is especially true along ancient coastlines. At the end of the last ice age, as global temperatures rose and ice sheets melted, sea levels climbed dramatically over thousands of years. Shorelines retreated inland, sometimes by many kilometers. Areas that once supported human settlement, estuaries, river mouths, fertile coastal plains, were submerged beneath the ocean. These are exactly the kinds of places where early sedentary life might have flourished, rich in fish, plant resources, fresh water, and transport routes. Yet if such communities existed, many now lie far beyond the reach of conventional archaeology. What survives on land may therefore represent only part of the story, a biased sample shaped by what the sea has spared. Rivers, too, conceal as much as they reveal. Floodplains are dynamic environments. Sediment accumulates. Channels shift. Old courses are abandoned. New ones carve through earlier layers. A settlement that once stood at the edge of a river may now be buried beneath meters of silt or eroded away entirely. In regions like Mesopotamia, where rivers have wandered across the plain for millennia, the archaeological landscape is both rich and incomplete. Some sites survive as tells, preserved by continuous occupation. Others vanish into the alluvium, detectable only through remote sensing or not at all. Scholars still debate how many early communities remain hidden in these buried landscapes, and how their absence shapes the story we tell. Then there is the problem of perishable materials. Much of early human life is built from things that do not last: wood, reeds, textiles, leather, basketry. These materials formed houses, tools, clothing, containers, and countless everyday objects. Yet they rarely survive, except under exceptional conditions. A settlement built primarily from organic materials may leave only faint traces in the soil. Its inhabitants may have lived complex, organized lives, but their physical record may be almost invisible after thousands of years. The evidence remains incomplete, not because these societies lacked complexity, but because their materials have been returned to the earth. Even where remains do survive, they are often fragmented by later history. Cities grow on top of earlier cities. Foundations are reused. Bricks are robbed for new construction. Entire ancient layers are destroyed by subsequent occupation. In some of the most historically rich regions, this layering is so dense that reaching the earliest levels becomes technically difficult or impossible without damaging what lies above. The deeper one digs, the more one risks erasing the very history one seeks to uncover. Archaeology becomes an exercise in careful compromise, and the earliest phases are sometimes the most vulnerable. This leads to a quiet but profound realization. The first civilization, if such a thing existed as a single identifiable entity, may not be the one best preserved. It may not be the one most studied. It may not be the one whose name survives in textbooks. It may belong to a place whose remains are too fragmentary to interpret with confidence, or too deeply buried to access, or too thoroughly erased by time to detect at all. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it does shape the narrative in powerful ways. What we call the first civilization is partly a reflection of what we have been able to see. Scholars are increasingly aware of this bias, and it has begun to reshape the way the question is approached. Rather than searching for a single origin point, more attention is given to processes that could have occurred in multiple regions under similar conditions. Stable climate periods, access to water, fertile land, manageable ecosystems, and the gradual accumulation of social complexity all create environments where civilization-like structures can emerge. If these conditions exist in more than one place, and they clearly do, then it becomes less likely that civilization has a single birthplace, and more likely that it arises independently in several regions, each leaving behind a different kind of record. This does not mean all early societies are equal in their complexity or influence. Some clearly reach higher levels of organization, scale, and durability than others. But it does mean that the story is broader than the traditional focus on a few well-known regions. It suggests that the first civilization is not a fixed point, but a moving horizon, shaped by discovery, interpretation, and the uneven survival of evidence. There is also the issue of time itself. Civilizations do not begin in an instant. They emerge gradually, sometimes over centuries or even millennia. A settlement may grow slowly, accumulate features of complexity, and only later be recognized as a city. A network of communities may become more integrated over time, eventually forming a state. Writing may develop in stages, from simple marks to full systems. At what point does one say that civilization has begun? The answer depends on which stage is considered decisive, and that decision is not purely objective. It reflects the priorities of the observer as much as the reality of the past. One lesser-known challenge is the tendency of later civilizations to overwrite earlier ones. Conquest, migration, and cultural change can obscure or replace earlier systems, leaving behind only fragments. A powerful later society may adopt, adapt, or erase the institutions of its predecessors, creating a layered history that is difficult to disentangle. In some cases, what appears to be a sudden emergence of civilization may actually be the visible phase of a longer, more complex sequence that includes earlier, less visible stages. All of this contributes to a sense that the beginning of civilization is not just distant, but fundamentally uncertain. It is not a puzzle with a missing piece waiting to be found. It is a mosaic, with entire sections lost, others rearranged, and still others only partially understood. The edges are blurred, the center is incomplete. And yet, even with these limitations, the picture that emerges is remarkable. What survives suggests that human beings in different parts of the world, at different times, under different conditions, repeatedly discovered ways to organize themselves into larger, more complex, more durable societies. They built on earlier knowledge, adapted to local environments, and created systems that could support growing populations and increasingly intricate forms of life. These systems vary in their details, but they share underlying principles: the management of resources, the coordination of labor, the establishment of hierarchy, and the creation of shared meanings that bind people together. The missing beginnings do not erase this pattern. They complicate it. They remind us that the story is larger than any single site or region. They suggest that the first civilization, if it is to be identified at all, must be understood as part of a broader process, rather than a singular event. It is not the first spark, but the first visible flame, and even that flame may have been preceded by others that flickered and disappeared without leaving a trace. In this sense, the problem of missing beginnings is not just a limitation, it is a clue. It points to the possibility that civilization is not an anomaly, not a rare accident confined to one place, but a recurring outcome of human societies reaching certain thresholds of organization and interaction. The fact that we cannot see all the early examples does not diminish their existence. It challenges us to think more carefully about what we mean when we speak of beginnings. And so the search continues, not as a quest for a single answer, but as an ongoing effort to piece together a story that is both fragmented and expansive. Each new discovery adds detail, but also raises new questions. Each site reveals something unique, but also connects to a larger pattern. The first civilization remains elusive, not because it is unknowable, but because it is not confined to one place or moment. It is a process that unfolds across time and space, leaving behind traces that we are still learning to read. In the end, the missing beginnings do not prevent us from understanding civilization. They prevent us from simplifying it. They force us to accept that the past is more complex, more varied, and more uncertain than any single narrative can capture. And in that uncertainty, there is a deeper truth. Civilization is not a single story with a clear starting point, but a tapestry woven from many threads, some visible, some hidden, and some lost to time. By this point, the old question has almost dissolved under its own weight. Who was the first civilization on Earth? Really, it still sounds like it should have one answer, but the evidence has been pushing in another direction for some time. The earliest cities do not all appear in the same form. The earliest states do not all emerge through the same sequence. Writing begins in some places and not in others. Monumentality arrives early here. Dense urban planning there. Durable kingship somewhere else. The more one compares them, the harder it becomes to believe that civilization was a single invention made once and then imitated by everyone who came after. What survives in the record suggests something more complicated and, in many ways, more interesting. Civilization is not one threshold crossed in one place, but a gradual process made up of several thresholds crossed at different times by different societies. This does not mean the concept becomes meaningless. Quite the opposite. It means the concept must be handled with more precision. Civilization can still refer to a real change in the scale of human life. It can still describe the emergence of large settled populations, institutions stronger than households, formal hierarchies, specialized labor, durable memory systems, and landscapes reshaped to sustain organized power. But it is better understood as a convergence than an invention. The elements gather slowly. Agriculture does not automatically produce cities. Cities do not automatically produce states. States do not always require writing at first. Monument building does not guarantee urbanism, and yet, under certain ecological and social pressures, these elements begin to cluster. Once enough of them do, a recognizable civilization appears. That clustering happens unevenly. In some places, like southern Mesopotamia, urban scale and administrative complexity arrive early and dramatically, while stable political unification remains elusive for long periods. In Egypt, territorial kingship and ideological centralization become unusually strong, tied to the narrow geography of the Nile Valley and to a royal sacred vision of order. In the Indus region, planned cities, standardization, and material coherence reach remarkable heights. Yet the surviving evidence does not reveal kings or dynasties in the familiar Mesopotamian or Egyptian style. In Norte Chico, organized labor and monumental construction emerge astonishingly early, without written archives in any conventional sense. Each case crosses into civilizational life, but by a different route, and with a different visible emphasis. This is why the search for one exact moment keeps failing. There is no single switch. There are multiple thresholds, and they do not always align. One society may become sedentary very early, but remain small in scale. Another may develop hierarchy and ritual centers before dense urbanism. Another may produce cities before political unity. Another may centralize authority before leaving abundant texts. Scholars still debate where the decisive line should be drawn, because the line itself is partly an artifact of modern expectation. The evidence remains incomplete, but no single explanation fully accounts for the rise of civilization if it treats one feature as universally decisive. A better image might be that of a river delta. A single river approaching the sea does not remain singular. It divides into channels, some broad, some narrow, some silting up, some finding new paths, all carrying the same water in different forms. Civilization behaves something like that. The older current of human social complexity, already present in foraging networks, ritual life, exchange systems, seasonal aggregation, and early villages, approaches a new environmental and demographic situation after the Ice Age. Then it branches. In one place, it produces temple cities. In another, divine kingship along a narrow floodplain. In another, gridded urbanism with drainage and standard brick. In another, ceremonial centers and coordinated labor tied to irrigation and maritime exchange. The current is shared. The channels are multiple. This way of seeing the problem also helps explain why some early societies feel close to civilization without fitting neatly inside it. Sites like Jericho, Çatalhöyük, Göbekli Tepe, and Longshan are not irrelevant because they fail a textbook definition. They are part of the process. They show that human beings repeatedly experimented with settlement, ritual concentration, hierarchy, labor coordination, and place-bound identity before later systems fused these experiments into more durable structures. They are not false starts. They are thresholds in their own right. Civilization does not begin by leaving them behind. It begins by absorbing the possibilities they reveal. One lesser-known but important consequence of this view is that it shifts attention away from invention and toward maintenance. People often speak of the first civilization as though its main mystery were how it appeared. But once the question is reframed as process, another mystery becomes just as important: how such systems were kept going. A large village can persist through custom and proximity. A city requires sustained flows of food, labor, authority, and meaning. A state requires legitimacy that can survive succession, bad harvests, local resistance, and regional strain. Writing archives obligations. Ritual dignifies extraction. Monumentality stabilizes hierarchy. Irrigation binds communities to collective risk. In this sense, civilization is not just the making of complexity. It is the maintenance of complexity against constant pressure. That pressure also explains why early civilizations can look both innovative and fragile at the same time. Each one solves certain problems while creating others. Agriculture supports denser populations but narrows dietary resilience. Surplus enables specialists but also inequality. Writing strengthens administration but can concentrate power in fewer hands. Cities foster exchange and innovation but expose people to disease, crowding, and dependence on distant resources. Centralized kingship can coordinate labor and defend territory, but it also turns political failure into civilizational risk. The process is cumulative, but not guaranteed. A civilization can emerge gradually and still collapse suddenly if too many of its dependencies fail at once. This is another reason the notion of a single birthplace is misleading. A true birthplace suggests a stable source from which later forms unfold naturally. Early civilizations are not like that. They are precarious concentrations built under specific conditions. Some endure for millennia. Some contract or transform rapidly. Some disappear so thoroughly that later peoples build over them without remembering. To ask who was first is therefore useful only if it leads toward a wider understanding of how many things had to come together and how unstable that coming together always was. The process view also helps resolve a long-standing tension in the question, Why does Mesopotamia so often seem to win in mainstream history, even when other early societies appear equally impressive in some respects? The answer is not simply bias, though bias plays a role. It is that Mesopotamia offers one of the earliest clearly visible convergences of several major thresholds at once: large urban centers, institutionalized temple economies, administrative technologies, and the earliest accepted writing. It is a particularly legible convergence.
Egypt offers a different but equally powerful convergence soon after, centered on unified kingship and monumental state order. The Indus offers another, though less textually transparent to us. What we call the first civilization is often just the first case where enough thresholds overlap in a way modern scholarship feels able to recognize without hesitation. And yet hesitation remains wise. There may have been other convergences now lost or still hidden. There may have been societies whose material record was too fragile, too submerged, or too poorly preserved to enter the standard canon. Even among the known cases, interpretation continues to change.
New excavations, improved dating, remote sensing, isotopic analysis, microarchaeology, and revised theoretical frameworks keep reshaping the timeline and the categories. The beginning of civilization is not a solved line in a schoolbook. It is an active field of argument, refined each time a buried settlement, canal, cemetery, or archive adds a new piece to the pattern. So no single place and no single moment can carry the whole weight of the answer. Civilization is older than its first texts, broader than its first kings, and more gradual than its first cities make it seem. It begins in settled life, deepens with surplus, intensifies with institutions, enlarges with hierarchy, and becomes durable with systems of memory and control.
Different societies arrive at these layers in different orders, and that order matters. It shapes everything that follows. But the underlying transformation is shared. Human beings learn to live in worlds that are larger than kinship, denser than village life, more unequal than earlier communities, and more dependent on organized abstractions than any social order before them. Perhaps that is the truest answer available. The first civilization was not born in a single morning, beside a single river, under a single ruler. It emerged wherever human communities crossed. Enough of these thresholds to create a new scale of life and sustain it. Some crossed sooner, some left clearer traces, some fit later definitions more comfortably. But the beginning itself was plural. And once that is accepted, the ancient world becomes richer rather than poorer. The question stops being a contest for a trophy and becomes a study of parallel human experiments, each discovering in its own way how difficult it is to organize thousands of people into one lasting order. Civilization seen like this is not a monument with one foundation stone. It is a long construction site, spread across continents and centuries, with many crews working in different materials under different skies, toward forms of permanence none of them could fully control. Even after all the complications, all the competing claimants, all the buried thresholds and missing beginnings, mainstream history still tends to return to the same answer. If someone asks plainly and without patience for nuance which civilization came first, the name most often given is Sumer. More specifically, scholars often point toward southern Mesopotamia in the late 4th millennium BCE, and especially toward the urban world of Uruk as the earliest widely accepted civilization in the fullest conventional sense. That answer is not arbitrary. It is not simply inertia. It rests on a real convergence of evidence, so strong that, despite every necessary caution, it remains difficult to dislodge. The key phrase is widely accepted. Sumer usually comes first, not because it was certainly the first in every possible respect, but because it is the earliest case in which several major thresholds appear together in a form both substantial and archaeologically legible. There are large cities, there are monumental precincts, there is institutional control over labor and resources. There is clear settlement hierarchy across a broader region. There are administrative devices leading into writing and then writing itself. There are seals, standardized vessels, accounting systems, and evidence of specialized production. There are outward links through trade and cultural expansion. In short, southern Mesopotamia offers one of the earliest places where civilization does not merely seem to be emerging. It is already operational. Uruk stands at the center of that conclusion, because its scale forces the issue. Earlier settlements can always be debated. A large village may or may not be a city. A ritual center may or may not imply state-like authority. Monumentality may or may not signal a full civilizational system. Uruk makes such hesitation harder to sustain. By the late 4th millennium BCE, it appears to have reached an urban scale unmatched, or nearly unmatched, anywhere on Earth at the time. Its monumental architecture is not isolated. Its institutions are not inferred from one building or one symbolic object. They are woven through the whole urban landscape. This is one reason Uruk continues to dominate the argument. It is simply too large, too organized, and too complex to dismiss as a precursor. Writing strengthens the case further. The earliest widely accepted true writing emerges in this same broad southern Mesopotamian environment. That matters not because writing alone defines civilization, but because it makes the institutional character of the society visible in unusually direct terms. Administrative tablets confirm what architecture and settlement patterns already suggest. This is a world of managed surplus, recorded obligations, counted goods, and durable organizational memory. When a civilization both looks civilizational and begins to describe its own transactions in preserved records, historians gain a level of confidence they rarely enjoy for earlier, or less, documented societies. There is also the matter of continuity. Mesopotamia does not produce a single isolated experiment that vanishes without consequence. The Sumerian world and the wider Mesopotamian traditions that follow it help establish patterns that endure and evolve through millennia. Urban life, temple and palace institutions, scribal culture, law, literature, kingship, diplomacy, warfare among states, and an extraordinary continuity of settlement in the alluvial lands. This afterlife should not be confused with proof of absolute firstness, but it does make southern Mesopotamia feel foundational in a way few other early cases do. Later history keeps building there, and that accumulation reinforces the sense that one is standing near the beginning of something unmistakable. Still, there is a danger in the conventional answer. Once Sumer becomes the textbook winner, it begins to absorb more certainty than the evidence can fully support. People start hearing that Sumer was the first civilization and quietly translate it into stronger claims. The first complex society, the first organized religion, the first state, the first writing, the first city, the first everything that matters. That is where the simplification becomes misleading. Southern Mesopotamia was not first in every domain. Farming began much earlier, elsewhere, and in earlier regional phases. Large settled communities existed long before Uruk. Monumental ritual architecture appears before Sumerian cities. Egypt developed a very early and strikingly durable territorial state. The Indus built one of the ancient world's most impressive urban systems. Sumer is earliest in a specific cluster, not in all human achievement. Scholars who defend Mesopotamia's primacy usually do so more carefully than popular retellings suggest. They often argue that southern Mesopotamia provides the earliest broadly documented instance of a civilization combining urbanism, institutional hierarchy, administrative sophistication, and writing in one visible package. That is a strong claim, and it remains mainstream because no earlier known case currently displays the same bundle with the same level of preserved evidence. The evidence remains incomplete, yes, but within the known record, Uruk period Mesopotamia still holds a compelling lead. Egypt complicates the picture by being almost equally early in the rise of a recognizable state. By the late 4th and early 3rd millennia BCE, Egypt shows centralized kingship, writing, elite administration, and ideological unity on a scale that makes it one of the earliest indisputable civilizations. Why, then, does it usually come second in textbook order? Partly chronology, because the urban administrative developments in southern Mesopotamia are typically dated slightly earlier in their mature form. Partly emphasis, because the conventional model of civilization has long privileged the city and writing, and Mesopotamia appears to offer both in especially early combination. But if one were to define civilization primarily through unified territorial statehood and monumental royal ideology, Egypt could easily be advanced as the strongest early exemplar. The ranking depends on what is weighted most heavily. The Indus Valley complicates things in a subtler way. Its mature urban phase comes later than Uruk, so it is not usually proposed as absolutely first in chronology. Yet in some respects it feels astonishingly complete when it arrives. Large cities, standardized bricks, drainage systems, weights, seals, trade, craft organization, and a broad cultural coherence spread over immense distances. The problem is not lack of sophistication. The problem is opacity. Without a deciphered script, and without obvious kings or triumphal inscriptions, the political and institutional logic of the Indus remains less narratively available to modern historians. That can make it seem less foundational, even when materially it is every bit a civilization. Sumer's advantage in part is that it is both early and unusually legible. One lesser-known reason Mesopotamia dominates the first civilization label is simply the way evidence accumulates there. Southern Iraq and its surrounding regions have produced a dense, mutually reinforcing archive, settlement archaeology, tablets, seals, monumental precincts, administrative artifacts, later literary traditions, remembering earlier kings, and long sequences of urban occupation. Each category supports the others. A tablet is backed by a precinct is backed by settlement hierarchy, a city is backed by surrounding agricultural systems and smaller sites. This layered evidence creates confidence. It allows historians to say not merely that complexity existed, but that the mechanisms of that complexity are visible. Yet even here, uncertainty remains at the edges. The earliest phases of urbanization are still debated in detail. The balance between temple and palace is not fully settled. The exact tempo of writing's emergence remains under discussion. Regional interactions that nourish southern Mesopotamia are more intricate than older scholarship sometimes admitted. Scholars still debate how much of the so-called Uruk expansion was colonization, cultural influence, or economic networking. No single explanation fully accounts for every feature of the Mesopotamian rise. To say Sumer usually comes first is not to say the argument is closed. It is to say that among the available contenders, this remains the most robust shorthand. The phrase robust shorthand is important. Mainstream history often relies on simplification because teaching needs sequence, and sequence needs anchor points. Sumer becomes the anchor. Students can remember a place, a period, a river system, and an urban phenomenon. There is practical value in that. But the simplification becomes dangerous when it hides the real story, that Sumer was not a miraculous, isolated beginning, but the earliest well-documented crest of a much older and wider wave. Behind Uruk lie millennia of village life, farming, ritual centers, exchange networks, and slowly intensifying hierarchy. Beside Uruk stand Egypt and other rising centers. Beyond Uruk lie other independent civilizational trajectories that will later become impossible to ignore. So why does Mesopotamia usually come first? Because it is the earliest place where enough civilizational markers converge visibly and convincingly for modern scholarship to point and say, here, unquestionably, is one of humanity's first full urban civilizations. Because writing appears there early enough to illuminate the institutions already taking shape. Because the city of Uruk reaches a scale that forces recognition. Because later Mesopotamian traditions preserve and extend that achievement. And because, for all the incompleteness of the record, no earlier known society currently presents a clearer case under the classic bundle of criteria.
That answer is strong, but it should never be mistaken for simple. It is a best-supported conclusion, not a sacred truth. It is a map drawn from surviving evidence, not a perfect mirror of all that once existed. New discoveries could refine it. Buried sites, improved dating, or future breakthroughs in decipherment could alter the balance of firstness in specific respects. The ancient world has a habit of reopening questions once thought settled. For now, though, when mainstream history gives the title to Sumer or to the Uruk world, it does so for understandable reasons, not because the matter is free of doubt, but because this is where the evidence presently gathers most densely around the old and stubborn idea of a beginning, and perhaps that is the fairest way to say it. Mesopotamia usually comes first, not because it stands alone, and not because everything begins there, but because it is where the earliest known civilization becomes hardest to deny. The mud-brick cities of the south, rising from canals and floodplain, do not erase the older villages behind them, or the rival claimants beside them. They simply make the transition visible with unusual force. In that visibility lies their enduring power over the human imagination. They look, more than anything earlier that we can currently see so clearly, like the moment when the world of scattered communities tipped decisively into the world of cities, institutions, records, and organized power. In the end, the oldest answer remains unfinished, because civilization itself is unfinished.
It begins in mud and grain, in floodplains and storage pits, in walls raised not for glory at first, but for staying alive a little more securely than before. Then it grows teeth and memory. It builds temples, records rations, buries elites with more care than common people, turns rivers into systems, and persuades entire populations to live inside structures larger than kin, larger than season, larger than any single life. The first civilization, whether one names Sumer, Uruk, Egypt, or a broader field of early experiments, is not important only because it came first. It matters because it reveals the pattern that will follow humanity almost everywhere afterward. Civilization is not merely a beginning, it is a recurring bargain. That bargain is simple in outline and immense in consequence.
People surrender some freedom of movement in exchange for security of food. They accept hierarchy in exchange for coordination. They tolerate extraction in exchange for infrastructure, ritual order, defense, or the promise of stability. They allow memory to be centralized in temples, palaces, and archives because large societies cannot function otherwise. They build worlds so intricate that no single person can understand them fully, yet everyone depends on them all the same. What survives in the record suggests that this bargain is never perfectly voluntary, never evenly beneficial, and never free of risk. But it is powerful enough that once discovered, it keeps returning.
That is why the first civilization is best understood, not as a winner in an ancient race, but as the first visible proof of a new human condition. Before civilization, people live in bands, camps, villages, and seasonal networks bound above all by kinship, custom, and direct memory. After civilization, increasing numbers of people live under abstractions, institutions, offices, records, gods tied to states, kingship tied to land, law tied to text, labor tied to quotas, identity tied to larger political worlds. The scale changes everything. People begin to inhabit systems that can outlast them, and often forget them, and yet those systems remain human from top to bottom. They are built from ordinary acts, repeated, until they become structure. Someone carries water, someone cuts reeds,
Someone seals a jar, someone counts sheep, someone clears a canal bank under a hot sky, someone kneads clay into bricks that will hold up a temple wall, someone buries a parent beneath a floor, someone measures grain with anxious care, because one mistake means hunger later, someone scratches a mark onto wet clay,
not knowing that thousands of years afterward, another, human being, will look at that mark and call it the beginning of history. Civilizations appear enormous from above, but they are made from the same small efforts that once built villages. Only the concentration is different, and the consequences are far larger. This is what makes the question so haunting. The first civilization is both real and elusive.
Real, because there are moments in the archaeological record when scale, hierarchy, writing, and institutional power become impossible to deny. Elusive, because all such moments grow from earlier layers that were already changing human life long before the first city looked fully urban. The evidence remains incomplete. Coastlines are drowned, floodplains are buried, mudbrick has dissolved, scripts remain undeciphered. Entire peoples may have lived through thresholds of complexity now lost to us. No single explanation fully accounts for all of it, and perhaps none ever will. The beginning is too gradual, too plural, and too damaged by time. Still, some truths stand. Civilization is not natural ease. It is managed dependence.
It is the conversion of abundance into structure, and of uncertainty into hierarchy. It is the art of making thousands live together through rules, symbols, and systems stronger than personal memory. It produces beauty on an immense scale: temples, writing, mathematics, administration, art, architecture, cosmology. It also produces burdens, labor extraction, rank, vulnerability to failure, and the perpetual risk that the system holding everything together may become too rigid, too unequal, or too fragile to endure. From the first cities onward, civilization carries both creation and strain in the same body. That double character is already visible at the beginning. Uruk rises because a river plain can be organized, but it depends on that organization never fully breaking.
Egypt unifies around the Nile, but its order must be performed and maintained without pause. The Indus plans its cities with astonishing discipline, yet its silence keeps many of its internal tensions hidden from us. Every early civilization discovers some way of binding land, labor, and belief together. Every one of them also lives under the possibility that flood, drought, salinity, conflict, political fracture, or simple overreach may loosen those bindings again. The first civilization is therefore not just the dawn of order, it is the dawn of large-scale fragility. This may be the deepest legacy of all. Later empires often imagine themselves new, final, or chosen, yet they inherit a structure first assembled in those ancient floodplains and early urban corridors.
The city as command center, the archive as memory, the ruler as guarantor of order, the temple or palace as collector of surplus, the countryside as provider, the laboring majority as the hidden foundation beneath visible greatness. These are among the oldest patterns in organized human life, and they begin so early that they can seem almost permanent, but they are not permanent. The archaeological record is filled with reminders that even the first civilizations could falter, fragment, and vanish. So the oldest answer stays unfinished, not because the question is foolish, but because the past resists the neatness the question asks for.
If the answer must be compressed, then southern Mesopotamia still stands nearest the front of the line, with Uruk and the Sumerian world offering the earliest, broadly accepted full convergence of city, institution, and writing. But if the answer is allowed to breathe, it becomes wider and truer. The first civilization was not a single isolated miracle. It was the earliest visible crest of a much larger transformation in human existence, one reached by different societies in different ways, some known clearly, some only dimly, some perhaps forever lost. And that may be the most honest final image to leave behind. Not a throne room, not a pyramid, not a king declaring the world ordered at last. Instead, an ancient river at dusk, water moving past reeds and mudbanks.
Beyond it, fields darkening after harvest. Beyond them, a rising settlement where lamps begin to glow one by one. Somewhere inside, are granaries, shrines, workshops, courtyards, ledgers, and sleeping households. Somewhere a child is born into a world already organized by systems older than memory. Somewhere an official checks a store of grain. Somewhere a laborer lies down with aching shoulders. Somewhere the dead rest beneath floors or tombs already folded into the architecture of permanence. Nothing in the scene announces that this is the beginning. That is why it is the beginning. Civilization enters the world quietly at first, then grows so large that later ages mistake its survival for inevitability. But the first cities were never inevitable. They were fragile human arrangements against time, water, hunger, and forgetting. And because they were fragile, their traces still matter. They remind us that the oldest civilizations were not the end of prehistory so much as the start of a long experiment that humanity is still living inside now. Night settles slowly over the oldest landscapes. Rivers that once carried the first heavy barges of grain still move through their valleys, though their courses have changed, and their banks no longer belong to the same worlds. The cities that seemed permanent have mostly fallen back into earth. Their mud bricks softened, their timber vanished, their names broke apart, and had to be rebuilt from shards, seals, bones, and marks in clay. And yet something of them remains, not only in ruins, but in the shape of human life that followed. The first civilizations were never simple triumphs. They were acts of concentration, of hope certainly, but also of strain. People gathered near water because water offered life, and then discovered that life, gathered closely enough, begins to ask difficult things of them. It asks for labor at scale. It asks for trust in strangers. It asks for obedience to calendars, storehouses, rituals, and rulers. It asks human beings to live inside systems they did not build alone and could not easily leave. From that bargain came beauty and burden together. Temples rose. Writing appeared. Memory lengthened. Power hardened. The world grew more organized and more fragile. Perhaps that is why the question of firstness still lingers. Not because we need a champion from the ancient world, but because we sense that somewhere back there in reed marshes, flood basins, village lanes, and the first crowded city precincts, humanity crossed into a new relationship with time. People stopped living only from season to season and began building for generations they would never meet. They filled granaries for futures not yet visible. They raised walls against dangers still unnamed. They carved order into landscape and hoped it would hold. Somewhere along a riverbank, dusk becomes darkness. A field cools after heat. Water presses softly past the reeds. In a distant house, a lamp flickers behind a mud-plastered wall. Someone finishes counting jars. Someone lays down beside stored grain. Someone listens to the breathing of children already born into a world of obligation and shelter, memory and dependence. Nothing announces that this is the threshold of civilization. There is no drumbeat, no grand proclamation, no clear dividing line between before and after. Only the quiet accumulation of human effort becoming structure, and maybe that is the truest ending. The first civilization was not a single moment of arrival. It was a slow gathering of permanence, in places where people chose or were forced to remain. The traces are broken, the record incomplete, the debate unfinished. But the image endures. River, field, settlement, night. A fragile order glowing against the dark, as human as it has always been.